Chapter 726. Even though zoo wasn't as big as paradise, it was still a venue card that took up a lot of space. A mere 80 by 120 space was naturally unable to accommodate all of them. Therefore, when Dake unfolded zoo, he could choose a location to cover the area. With the blue summoning area as the boundary, there was a stone wall that protected the blue summoning area. Then, there was a winding road with a dense cluster of short trees in the middle of the area. In the red area, there was a pond pavilion. When the pond spread out, it actually forced the crypt grass out. Even though the crypt grass was a grass-type plant, its secondary attribute was the ground type. Grass subdued water, and water subdued earth. The crypt grass lived in the dark and dry areas of the dungeon, and didn't have an affinity with water. In the blink of an eye, the dark enchantment released by the totem monster spread over, and covered a small part of the red area. The crypt grass immediately retreated into the dark enchantment, and quickly dived back into the dry area. First website. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP, but in the process, there were obvious signs of corrosion on its leaves. This made Dake immediately realize that the dark enchantment released by the totem monster was harmful. The crypt grass drilled back into the ground and successfully avoided the damage. Dake's eyes flashed and he quickly said, "You receive the baton, lunar god beast." The effects of the dark enchantment were actually quite varied, but most of them had negative effects such as corrosion and weakening. They also rejected the light attribute, and had an affinity with the dark attribute. In Dake's deck, the only dark attribute magical spirits that belonged to the first tier were the Lunar God Beast and the Curse Cage. Little Devil Beast. Without a Great Sin card, the Curse Cage. Little Devil Beast couldn't withstand a single blow. Naturally, he could only rely on the Lunar God Beast. Squeak. As illusory beast, Ibu let out a soft cry. Its body turned into light in the blink of an eye and returned to the magic card. The Lunar God Beast, holding its head, drilled out of the vortex where it was originally. Although the Moon God Beast was based on a rabbit, it didn't look like a rabbit at first glance. It raised its head and opened its eyes timidly. Its eyes were red and its two big ears were trembling slightly. But in the next moment, it felt an extremely warm energy being channeled into its body, causing its magic power, attack power, and defense to increase by 200 points at the same time. The Moon God Beast's magic attack and defense was originally 1400/1400/800. With the Zoo's effect, it instantly increased to 1600/1600/1000. These three attributes were already quite outstanding among 3-star magic guide fairies. Even when compared to the Oxhead Hatchet Man, he wasn't any weaker. The soul of the Moon God Beast was comforted, and it raised its head bravely. Dake then gave the order to attack. Thus, this pink rabbit, which didn't look like a rabbit, moved its short legs and rushed toward the other side. Dake continued to summon after 3 seconds. In the name of Dake Dimming, I summon the illusory beast, Ibu. Yes, he summoned the illusory beast, Ibu once again. And this time it only took him 2 seconds to summon it. The White Gouda, who was focused on the situation, didn't notice, but some students, professors, and audience members who had some impression of the zoo, all recalled the terror of the animal army. A 2-second summon with a 2-second cooldown. Before the Moon God Beast ran into the dark barrier, Dake had already summoned the adorable beast. As soon as the adorable beast appeared, it immediately shrank behind the fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit, and looked around cleverly. It knew how to protect itself very well. On the other side, the 6-star illusory beast, Changeable Beast, was also ready to attack. Dark's original purpose of raising its star was to fight against the Oxhead Hatchet Man, but he did not expect that the Oxhead Hatchet Man would be completely annihilated before the Oxhead Hatchet Man could make a move. But this was how a magician duel was. Once the decision was made, there was no turning back. He gave a detailed order to the illusory beast, Changeable Beast, and ordered it to invade the red side and protect the Moon God Beast from behind. Then he ordered the illusory beast, Ibu, to stay in the red side and defend together with the fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit. With this, the 5 magician fairies in the field all did what they wanted to do and maintained a fairly uniform pace. Dake only had Big Milkkin and Laughing Mask left in his hand. It could be said that he had done all he could. Magician duels usually use the tactic of having multiple players protecting one player. Through all kinds of methods, a super strong core magician fairy could be used to crush the opponent. But sometimes there would be a battle between two armies. At this time, it was necessary to test the duelist's ability to see the big picture and command the team. Dake actually didn't put in much effort to command a team, so he was only slightly better than his peers. After he finished his initial command, he immediately looked at the red side of the field. At this time, the moon god beast had already crossed the center line and rushed to the arched bridge that spanned across the pool. It touched the boundary of the dark barrier. It was very sensitive to the power of darkness, but it didn't hesitate to cross over. The barrier that was supposed to act as a barrier didn't obstruct it, and it entered without any hindrance. This was somewhat unexpected. A special summoning of a dark element magician fairy? White Gouda glanced at the moon god beast, and took out another card from the 4 remaining cards in his hand and loudly chanted. In the name of White Gouda, I summoned the dark shadow demonic leech. After 3 seconds of extreme summoning, White Gouda finally summoned a second-tier magician fairy in the dark barrier. The demonic leech was a flat monster that looked like a leech. They were associated with the totem monsters in the dungeon. In every 10 totem monsters, there would be a demonic leech. Although the demonic leech looked like a worm, it was an elemental type. It was born in various elemental tides, and had the corresponding elemental abilities. The totem monsters had high defense, low attack and extremely slow movement speed. The demonic leech had low defense, high attack, and extremely fast movement speed. They complemented each other perfectly. The dark shadow demonic leech was an associated monster of the dark element, totem monsters, and could hide in the shadows. Card name, Dark Shadow Demonic Leech. Type, Fairy card. Level, *******. Race, Elemental type. Attribute, Dark element. Magic power, 1800. Attack, 1900. Defense, 100. Ultimate skills, Heart of Shadow Worm Absorption Split. This wasn't the first time White Gouda summoned the Dark Shadow Demonic Leech in a duel. Even without the totem monster, the Magic Guiding Fairy could create a high-concentration elemental environment and use it as a special summon. After that, its sure kill skill would allow it to become a ladder to summon a higher-level Star Magic Guidance sprite. White Gouda was currently using the Dark Element Dungeon series, and the Dark Shadow Demonic Leech was very useful. Of course, when facing a low-level Magic Guiding Fairy, the Dark Shadow Demonic Leech would be the scariest killer. White Gouda's eyes darkened as he ordered the Dark Shadow Demonic Leech to attack the Lunar God Beast. The Dark Shadow Demonic Leech's attack wouldn't be able to break through the Fairy Tail Rabbit, but he didn't think that the Lunar God Beast would have the same defense as the Fairy Tail Rabbit. Since Dake dared to let the Magic Guiding Fairy enter the Dark Ward, Dark Shadow Demonic Leech. The black demonic leech that was only half a meter long silently sneaked into the shadows. Under the Dark Ward's cover, the entire area was filled with shadows. With the Heart of Shadow, the Dark Shadow Demonic Leech could move freely in the shadows, and its speed was extremely fast. However, the Lunar God Beast heard White Gouda's voice, and it became alert. It suddenly stopped moving forward, and its 2 long ears suddenly perked up. Its cute face revealed a panicked expression, and it looked like it was running around in a panic. However, it didn't turn around and run away. Being timid and cowardly was one of its characteristics. However, the nature of the digitized beast and the Magic Guiding Fairy gave it the desire to fight. It tensed up its ears and listened carefully to the sounds around it, trying to catch the Dark Shadow Demonic Leech's tracks. However, the Dark Shadow Demonic Leech that was moving around in the shadows didn't make any sound that could be caught until it leaped out of the shadows. At that moment, the Dark Shadow Demonic Leech that was hiding behind the Lunar God Beast turned into a pitch-black arrow and shot toward the back of the Lunar God Beast's head like a bolt of lightning. The Dark Shadow Demonic Leech's 1,900 points of attack power couldn't break through the Fairy Tail Animal's defense, but it could easily tear through the Lunar God Beast's pink skin. However, in that instant, the petite and adorable magic elf instantly turned around with an astonishing reaction. Its two large ears rotated in a circle like a fan. After which, its crescent-shaped right claw grabbed at the black figure behind it, as if it was catching a fish. When it turned around, the pitch-black fog had already climbed up its right claw. Under the cover of this dark energy, the lunar god beast's attack power was increased by 300 points in a short period of time. Bang! The lunar god beast tried to grab the dark shadow demonic leech, but when it was about to get close, it suddenly changed its grip into a slap. The two magic guide fairies clashed for the first time. The moon god beast was forced back by the terrifying force and staggered backward. The dark shadow demonic leech was also sent flying by the slap. The magic power of both sides decreased as a result. Demonic shadow leech suck. The moment the white Gouda's voice sounded, the dark shadow demon leech touched the ground and disappeared as if it had fallen into water. The moon god beast didn't even have time to adjust its body. The dark shadow demon leech, which had been circling around in the shadows, drilled out from under its feet and bit down on its foot. This was an insect-type sure-kill skill that could absorb the opponent's life force or mana while dealing damage. The mana of the moon god beast began to decrease at a speed visible to the naked eye. Meanwhile, the dark shadow demonic leech's mana was quickly replenished. When its mana exceeded the basic upper limit, the sure-kill skill split was automatically triggered, and a palm-sized demonic leech split from its body. The demonic leech only had 100 points of mana, and its attack and defense were both 0. However, it could exist as an independent entity and was an excellent sacrifice. After the demonic leeches split up, they scattered like fish and disappeared into the black shadow. Every demonic leech had the sure-kill skill that all shadow creatures knew: shadow concealment. This skill could ensure their survival to the greatest extent. The moon god beast suddenly cried out in pain and tried to lift its leg to break free from the dark shadow demon leech's bite. However, when the dark shadow demon leech used its sure-kill skill suck, the sure-kill skill created an extremely powerful suction force that glued the moon god beast's leg to the ground. The moon god beast couldn't lift its leg at all. Moreover, as its mana was sucked away, the moon god beast felt weak all over and couldn't use any strength. It could only let the dark shadow demon leech continue to suck it away. On the red team's platform, White Gouda finally let out a sigh of relief when he saw this scene. Even if it was the Dake Dimming, not every magic guide fairy was so powerful that it couldn't be defeated. For example, although the moon god beast in front of him had a combat strength that didn't match its appearance, it was only a 3-star magic guide fairy. It wasn't as scary as the fairy tale animal, rabbit. Just as White Gouda was thinking about this, a pink-white light suddenly descended and landed on the moon god beast's head. The moon god beast suddenly trembled, and the feeling of weakness caused by the loss of mana disappeared in an instant. Its mana that was constantly dropping suddenly rose by a large amount, and it recovered at a rate of 50 mana per second. The moon god beast's expression turned serious, and it quickly lifted the leg that it hadn't bitten, and stomped on the dark shadow demon leech fiercely. Poochie! How could the dark shadow demon leech, which only had 100 points of defense, block this angry stomp? It made a prompt decision and let go of its big mouth, but before it could dive back down, its head was crushed by the moon god beast's stomp. Although the dark shadow demon leech wasn't able to fully display its 1,600 points of attack, it was still heavily injured after that stomp. It hid in the shadows and didn't dare to show its head again. However, the dark shadow demon leech had already achieved half of its goal. Insect sucking and split gave birth to a total of 5 demon leeches. Each of these demon leeches could be used as a 1-star offering. If the dark shadow demon leech included itself, it would be a 9-star offering. It would be more than enough to summon a 3rd-tier magic guide fairy of any star rank. White Gouda already had a 3rd-tier magic guide fairy card in his hands from the very beginning of the first round. He used the Dark Barrier's blocking and confusing effect to summon the Dark Shadow Demonic Leech. Then he split into 5 1-star demonic leeches, and finally gathered enough sacrificial offerings for the summoning ritual. This was originally an open plan. Of course, it would be best if he could destroy the moon god beast during this period of time. Even if he couldn't destroy the moon god beast, it wouldn't be too bad. At this moment, Werther God had already raised the third-tier magic elven card into the air, and his expression was extremely solemn. As he chanted the sacrificial summoning spell, the strong light released from the magic guide fairy card was mixed with the color of blood. In the name of White Gouda, I sacrifice 1 dark shadow demon leech and 4 demon leeches, as offerings to summon the bloody serpent. He almost gritted his teeth as he chanted the last sentence. Even though the moon god beast knew what Dake was going to do after he reminded it, it couldn't do anything to the demon leech that was hiding in the shadows. The same was true for the fantasy beast, ever-changing monster. The countdown on the projection started to move quickly, and the smell of blood started to fill the air. The smell of blood mixed with the power of darkness, making the red half of the area even more murky. Suddenly, 5 rays of black light shot into the sky from the shadows on the ground, and a ray of red light shot out from the bloody serpent. The 6 rays of light met in the air, and under the guidance of the sacrificial summoning spell, they formed a huge and complicated sacrificial summoning array. The bloody serpent's ferocious head came out from the sacrificial summoning array. It seemed to be slow, but it was filled with an oppressive aura. Roar! The terrifying roar of the 8-star magic guide fairy finally pulled the audience back to reality. They were still stuck in the previous round. Werther God seemed to want to use this opportunity to tell the audience that fancy things were ultimately useless, and that the third-tier magic elves were the truly powerful ones. The bloody serpent's huge body was even taller than the dark barrier. The terrifying aura of blood and darkness spread out in all directions. As a student, it is indeed something to be proud of as a second-year student to successfully create an 8-star magic guide fairy card. Dake tapped on the table and said in a calm voice. The speaker on the table prevented his voice from being drowned out by the bloody serpent's roar. The White Gouda's rising emotions were cut off by this simple sentence. The veins on his forehead were twitching, and he tried his best to suppress his anger. He reached out his hand and pressed on a magic guide card in his hand. The bloody serpent was his trump card in his deck. Around this trump card, he had prepared several ways to strengthen it. At present, there was such a card that had always existed. He just had to wait for the sacrificial summoning spell's cooldown to end, and he could immediately summon it. At this moment, he only had 2 cards left in his hand. However, his summoning was still a little slow. The second round had already passed as the 2 magic guiding fairies tangled with each other. Battle Stage 3? 30s. The duel had entered the 3rd round, and a new variable was about to arrive. The White Gouda clenched his teeth and reached for his cards. The moment he saw the 2 new magic guide cards, the muscles on his cheeks couldn't help but expand. He then chuckled. Come on then. On the blue team's platform, Dake pulled out the 2 new magic guide cards from the top of the deck. He wasn't in a hurry. Dragon Bolito, Magic Gun, Dragon Bolito. Dragon Bolito could be said to be the highest star level magic guide card in Dake's deck. Dragon Bolito's star level was 7 stars, and he had enough offerings to summon it. However, Dake squinted his eyes and observed White Gouda's subtle expressions. He didn't make that choice. After the Silver Cup finals in the afternoon, he already had a good understanding of White's Bloody Serpent. Card name, Bloody Serpent. Type, Guide Card. Level, Race Reptile. Attribute, Dark, Magic Power. 4500, Attack 4000, Defense 2500. Ultimate Skills, Giant Beast, Village of Blood Mist, Black Jade Snake Ball. Although its aura was strong, it wasn't a gold card. Bloody Serpent had used 2 sure kill skills in the previous duels. One was the ultimate skill, Village of Blood Mist, which released blood mist and shrouded the entire arena in blood mist. The other one was the black light that shot out from its bloody mouth, Black Jade Snake Ball. The former was a pseudo-field skill, but it could move around using Bloody Serpent as its core. Its effect was very comprehensive. First, it had an area of effect. Although the damage wasn't high, it was very sustainable. Second, it could penetrate the target within the area, lowering their defense and messing up their minds. They would gradually go crazy and become the Bloody Serpent's food or even servants. Lastly, it could also give the Bloody Serpent the ability to recover HP and MP that magic guide fairies didn't have. Village of Blood Mist, was an ultimate skill that didn't cause much damage in a short period of time, but if it continued to occupy the field, its effect would gradually become obvious. It was more suitable in a crowded battlefield. The main attack of Bloody Serpent was Black Jade Snake Ball. Black Jade Snake Ball was very similar to Destructive Ray in terms of power and appearance. However, due to the Bloody Serpent's huge body, the black ray that it shot out had a very wide area of effect. Apart from that, Dake Dimensional also figured out its hidden passive skill, Giant Beast, through its performance in the competition. Giant Beast was an ultimate skill that could increase the body size, 3 measurements and pressure of the opponent. Bloody Serpent's 3 stats should have an additional 500 points of magic attack and defense, respectively. Furthermore, its 3 measurements were already extremely strong. After the increase of 500 points, Bloody Serpent's 3 measurements became 5000/4, 500/3000. Therefore, Bloody Serpent's attack method was very simple. It was just pure strength. Contestant White Gouda has successfully summoned an 8-star Bloody Serpent at the beginning of the 3rd round. In front of this terrifying giant serpent, can contestant Dake Diming's 2-star rabbit stand firm? The commentator said the last sentence in a very readable tone. Although the 2-star Fairy Tale World, Little Rabbit, was amazing, it was only a 2-star magic elf card after all. In front of the 8-star Bloody Serpent, it might not even be enough to fill the gaps between its teeth. Of course, as a commentator who was not a bad person, he would not jump to conclusions before the results were out. However, behind him, the audience's cheers seemed to have written the result on their faces. Although Dake Dimming had a magic elf card that was comparable to or even better than the Bloody Serpent, if he did not draw it, it would be useless. Since Dake Dimming still did not show any signs of taking action, the commentator was inclined to believe that he did not draw it. If that was the case, this duel would be very dangerous. If I were White Gouda, I would definitely seize this opportunity and try my best to win this round, he thought to himself. Facing the crazy waves caused by the Bloody Serpent, White Gouda's fans finally spoke up. On the other hand, Dake Diming's fans quieted down. Even the second-year students of the Aristocrat Academy held their breaths and watched with serious expressions. This duel seemed to have entered the climax at the beginning of the 3rd round. However, White Gouda was not satisfied with the pure power of the Bloody Serpent. The moment the cooldown of the sacrificial summoning ended, he picked out a new magic elf card from his hand, pressed it lightly and chanted, "In the name of White Gouda, I summon the soul-shattering jade." This was a special item card that he had refined under Ophelia Blood's guidance using the special treasure he had obtained from the underground city, the Soul Jade. The soul-shattering jade could make the magic elf immune to most changes, debuffs, and abnormal effects for 30 seconds. Although it would temporarily remove the buff effect of the magic elf, it was still a very powerful item card. White Gouda had used this soul-shattering jade to defeat Saraswati's final struggle. Now he was very lucky. He had already completed the puzzle of victory in the 3rd round. Without any hesitation, he summoned it and shot it at the Bloody Serpent, that was still more than 10 meters tall. Bang! As the soul-shattering jade shattered, a thin layer of jade light appeared on the body of the Bloody Serpent. However, it was this thin layer of jade light that gave the Bloody Serpent the ability to remain undefeated. Blood Mist Village Kill. Blood-red mist seeped out from the gaps between the scales of the Bloody Serpent and gradually spread out. The Bloody Serpent raised its head, flicked its tongue, and suddenly shot out. Its enormous body shot directly from the red half to the blue half, and with an almost barbaric momentum, it crushed the arched bridge above the pool into pieces. As for the moon god beast, who reacted quickly, it jumped into the pool and was spared from the disaster. However, the Bloody Serpent did not care about it at all. The fantastical beast, Polymorph, which was standing outside the dark barrier, was its first target. After all, the fantastical beast, Polymorph, did not have intelligence. Its reaction was half a beat slower, so it dodged under Dake's reminder, but it was still crushed by the Bloody Serpent. The Bloody Serpent's attack power was as high as 5,000 points. Although it did not use its full strength, it still crushed the fantastical beast, Polymorph, until it was left with only a sliver of HP. In a panic, it shrunk into the shape of a fruit-eating worm and rolled to the side. The bloody serpent, on the other hand, continued to crush the bloody serpent and rushed into the blue half. Ultimate skill. Teardrop shot. The lunar god beast, which had dove into the water, gathered its power between the antennae on its forehead. Balls of water condensed and shot out. Bang! The teardrop-like water ball was about to hit the bloody serpent's body, but it shattered like a bubble. Even the tearing effect was completely nullified by the soul-shattering jade. It didn't even delay the bloody serpent for a second. The white light was like a pillar that descended instantly. The cute beast, which was hiding behind the fairy tale animal, rabbit, released its ultimate skill, Heal Well. The fantastical beast, Polymorph, which only had a sliver of HP left, immediately felt the warmth flowing into it. Its 2,500 points of MP instantly recovered by more than half, and it continued to recover at a rate of 300 MP per second. Polymorph used Transform. Facing such a disadvantageous situation, Dake Diming's voice did not tremble at all. His calmness in such a situation made the White Gouda worry a little. This trace of worry was like a crack that was gradually tearing his heart apart. In the last two duels of the Silver Cup, he had used the Bloody Serpent to win by forcing his opponent to use the corresponding magic card first. However, in this duel, his pace was completely disrupted. The Bloody Serpent was in front of the fairy tale animal, Rabbit, in the blink of an eye. The White Gouda did not care about the lunar god beast, but he was determined to destroy the fairy tale animal, Rabbit. If he did not do that, he would not be able to get his way. Swallow it. The White Gouda stared at the pink rabbit that was hiding behind the tree stump and issued a cruel order to the Bloody Serpent. Roar! The Bloody Serpent suddenly opened its bloody mouth. Just as it was about to bite down, a similar roar suddenly came from behind it. Then a huge force pulled it back. It turned around and saw a bloody serpent that was exactly the same as itself, except that it was smaller. When the bloody snake straightened its body, it coiled around him like a chain and wrapped itself tightly around his body. It was the fantasy beast, Polymorph. The fantasy beast, Polymorph, finally used its ultimate skill, Transform. However, when the transform target was the third-tier magic fairy, the Bloody Serpent tried its best and only copied a small part of its data. This small part of the data allowed the Bloody Serpent to successfully increase its size and strength, but the part about the ultimate skill was copied to the colossal beast. This increased the fantasy beast, Polymorph's magic power to 3,000 points, its attack to around 3,500 points, and its defense to 3,000 points. Only in terms of defense, the fantasy beast, Polymorph, was almost the same as the Bloody Serpent. The fantasy beast, Polymorph, successfully restrained the Bloody Serpent by coiling its whole body. Seeing this, the Dake Diming finally made his move. He gently pulled out the armed card from his hand and silently chanted a summon. In the name of the Dake Diming, I summoned the magic gun. A white light shot out from the surface of the card and instantly projected in front of the fairy tale world. Little bunny. Me. The little bunny nervously looked at the driver that suddenly appeared and reached out to grab it. Then, another hand came out of nowhere and grabbed the handle of the spear first. Cute beast. The Dake frowned. Okay, chirp. The cute beast reluctantly put the magic gun back into the fairy tale world. Little bunny's hand. This small interlude did not have a significant impact on the situation. At this moment, the White Gouda's roar sounded. Black Jade Snake Ball. The Bloody Serpent, that was half of its body, gave up on the fantasy beast, Polymorph, and stared at the blue summoning area with its mouth wide open. The black shining ball of light quickly condensed in its mouth. As the Black Jade Snake Ball grew bigger and bigger, the aura it emitted became more and more terrifying. The fairy tale animal, Little Bunny, trembled under the aura. The cute beast was not afraid. It opened its eyes wide and stared at the Bloody Serpent. The fantasy beast, Ibu, started to run toward the edge of the battlefield. The Bloody Serpent's target was the fairy tale animal, Little Bunny. As long as it ran far enough, it would not be affected. The bloody serpent was also under the bloody serpent. Eyes, and suddenly, the bloody serpent exerted an upward force. The bloody serpent lightly hooked its finger and caused the bloody serpent to fly up into the sky. The black jade snake ball had finished condensing. The bloody serpent had to choose between the fairy tale animal, Little Bunny, and the fairy tale animal, Little Bunny. He did not hesitate and looked coldly at the bloody serpent. That humiliated him. He did not notice that in the dark barrier's blurry vision, the other bloody serpent climbed onto the shore and patted its little belly anxiously. Dong, dong, dong. The crisp sound of the bloody serpent patting its belly was completely covered by the roaring sound. The moon god beast's timing was perfect. When the bloody serpent spat out the black death light, the fairy tale animal, Little Bunny, disappeared without a trace. Chirp. The cute beast, that was completely exposed under the black jade snake ball, showed a confused expression. Then this 2-star magic elf with 0 attack and defense instantly evaporated under the black death light. However, from the bloody serpent's point of view, the cute beast and the fairy tale animal, Little Bunny, were killed at the same time. Because of this, he relaxed his brows and exhaled heavily. Finally, just as the word die came out halfway and his thoughts were about to clear up, he suddenly noticed something and suddenly lowered his head at that moment. Through the hazy dark barrier, the pink rabbit that could not be killed no matter how hard he tried entered his field of vision once again. Then he watched as the pink furry rabbit raised the gun-shaped driver above its head and pulled the trigger forcefully. Bang! The badge of light in the slot instantly shot out and rolled on the empty ground in front of it, drawing a huge hexagram magic array at an extremely fast speed. Almost at the same time, the driver in the fairy tale animal, Little Bunny's hand turned into light and disappeared. Then, from the hexagram magic array, a huge robot with red as its main color slowly floated out. The magic king of fire and earth, the light user, appeared under the gaze of countless people. Me. The fairy tale animal, Little Bunny's eyes were filled with excitement. It immediately ran toward the armored vehicle with its short legs. But as soon as it took a step, it suddenly jumped into the air, and its 2 little legs crossed each other in the air. The moon god beast, which was also small in size, lifted it up like a willow tree and then threw it out like a radish. Whoosh! The fairy tale animal, Little Bunny, flew toward the light user's breastplate with the wind. Me. No one noticed the fairy tale animal, Little Bunny's scream. Its body, which was tightly holding onto the tree stump, shot into the light user's body just like that. Thus, the gigantic machine began to move. In the name of the White Gouda, I summoned the burning blood force. The White Gouda resisted the ominous feeling in his heart and activated the magic card in his hand. The red blood flame suddenly rose, and the bloody serpent gained more power at that moment. It swung its tail and threw the fantasy beast, monster, that was entangled with it up. Then its huge tail forcefully resisted the fantasy beast, monster, and viciously whipped the light user that was in the middle of transforming. The fantasy beast, Ibu, who ran to the corner of the field, suddenly patted its little belly. The light user's figure, together with the fairy tale animal Little Bunny, instantly teleported to its side and appeared under the bloody serpent's eyes again. In the name of the Dake Dimming, I summoned the maniac mask. Dake silently chanted the summon. A clown mask with red makeup appeared next to the light user's hand. Under the control of the fairy tale animal, Little Bunny, it reached out and grabbed the maniac mask. The maniac mask suddenly became the size of the maniac mask's body. The light user put the maniac mask on its face. Happiness +3, rationality -3. Hysterical laughter faintly came out from the cockpit, and it became louder and louder, crazier and crazier. Mimamai. 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 10,000 words. 5th update. The unlimited monthly votes for the Spring Festival event will end today. Those who have monthly votes, please vote. Thank you. Chapter 727. After putting on the laughing mask, fairy tale animal, Bunny, revealed a crazy clown smile in the Lightbringer's cockpit. It stood in the tree stump, and although it was not wearing the mask, it was pressing its face in the same way. Its harmless expression turned ferocious in an instant. Its laughter was crazy and sharp, and its button-like eyes widened as blood gushed out from its eyes. The laughing mask's second effect, Laughing Clown, was triggered. Laughing Piercing Clown. The clown that has fallen into madness will stimulate its potential in order to fulfill its joy. Its attack will continue to rise and its defense will continue to fall. Duration of 3 minutes. Once activated, it cannot be deactivated. Lightbringer's mana had inherited Fairy Tale Animal Bunny's value, and with Zoo's buff, it was 1,200 points. His attack and defense were both 2,500 points. After Laughing Clown was triggered, Lightbringer's defense would decrease by 100 points every second, and its attack would increase by 100 points. Remember the URL. MVP can't you? 6. It only took 25 seconds for the 2,500 points of defense to be completely converted. Its attack would be boosted to 5,000 points. 1,200 points of mana. 5,000 points of attack. 0 points of defense. After 25 seconds, Lightbringer would turn into a blade as thin as a piece of paper. However, it would still take 25 seconds to convert its attack and defense. Dake observed the situation on the field, his mind quickly calculating the attack and defense of Bloody Serpent and Lightbringer, and his thoughts were getting clearer. Mimamai. Fairy Tale Animal Bunny. As crazy laughter did not stop. Because of this, an extremely strange atmosphere was born in the entire venue. Inside and outside the arena, everyone's attention was once again attracted by this pink furry rabbit. White Gouda, who had been staring at the pink bunny since the beginning, had his eyes bloodshot. He did not know the effect of the laughing mask. Fairy Tale Animal Bunny's maniacal laughter was filled with provocation in his eyes. The shrill laughter entered his ears as if it was mocking him. Because of this, he felt even more humiliated. His already unstable emotions once again slipped into the abyss of losing control. Bloody Serpent. A roar mixed with anger rushed out of his throat. For the nth time, White Gouda ordered Bloody Serpent to kill Fairy Tale Animal Bunny. 2 consecutive hits of flesh allowed Fairy Tale Animal Bunny to dodge the deadly attacks of Bloody Serpent, one after another. However, White Gouda could also see the origin of these 2 fats. He knew that Illusory Beast, Ibu had wasted one chance to use Mimic, and there wouldn't be any more fats after that. In other words, Fairy Tale Animal Bunny had nowhere to hide. As for the Fairy Tale Animal Bunny, since the Fairy Tale Animal Bunny still chose to teleport to avoid the Bloody Serpent, it meant that it still couldn't withstand the Bloody Serpent's tail whip. White Gouda made this judgment in a very short time. While the effect of Burning Blood Force was still active, the Bloody Serpent dragged its lower body, which was wrapped around by Illusory Beast, Polymorph, and crawled forward. The serpent swayed its head and smashed itself towards the Light Messenger, like a giant hammer. The Light Messenger was quite tall, and its height alone was more than 6 meters. However, compared to the Bloody Serpent, it was like a child. The Bloody Serpent suddenly burned with blood flames, and its strength was pushed to the limit. The power of this hammer was like a meteor crashing into the ground, and its power was terrifying. Not to mention that the Bloody Serpent's defense had dropped because of the laughing mask. Even if its defense hadn't dropped, it wouldn't have been able to withstand this terrifying attack. If the Bloody Serpent was hit by this hammer, Light Messenger, and the Fairy Tale Animal Bunny inside it would be killed instantly. However, the Bloody Serpent's attack was too long. When the Fairy Tale Animal Bunny threw itself at the Bloody Serpent, while laughing crazily, then it dashed past the Bloody Serpent and reached the dead end of the Bloody Serpent. Then, it raised its hand and laughed crazily. Me. Come out, wishful godly sword. The Fairy Tale Animal Bunny reached out its hand, and the light in its hand condensed into a sword. Outside the Bloody Serpent, the ground in front of the Bloody Serpent suddenly cracked open, and a huge red sword drilled out. The Bloody Serpent stepped forward and grabbed the hilt of the sword, pulling it out. Wishful godly sword. The bright light disappeared, and the sword was revealed. Everyone's attention was attracted by this huge sword that was burning with golden red flames. They didn't notice that the third round had already ended. The bloody serpent's jade light that was generated by the soul-breaking jade had completely disappeared. This powerful item card didn't have much effect in these 10 seconds. Instead, it reduced the effect of the bloody serpent. However, as the jade light shattered, the bloody serpent's mana recovery effect finally came back. The bloody serpent's mana that was consumed by the bloody serpent was slowly replenished. The bloody serpent's power surged. After smashing a huge hole in the ground, it forcefully turned its body and bit at the bloody serpent. However, the fairy tale animal, bunny, that summoned the wishful godly sword, still didn't have the slightest intention of confronting the bloody serpent head-on. The magical beast, ever-changing monster, more or less restricted the bloody serpent's movement. The fairy tale animal, bunny, laughed crazily while dragging the sword all the way. The bloody serpent's mana consumption after putting on the bloody serpent and summoning the wishful godly sword consumed hundreds of mana points per second. This made the bloody serpent's mana go up and down crazily like a roller coaster, but it still couldn't reach its limit. The bloody serpent seemed to be tailor-made for the bloody serpent. Is that the magic gun? Arvette stared at the bloody serpent and recalled the information of this special armed card. She was a little surprised. When she saw the fairy tale animal bunny as background, she didn't think about the bloody serpent and the fairy tale animal bunny as combination at all. This was mainly because the bloody serpent had a basic requirement for the driver. It had to be at least in human form. Although the fairy tale animal, bunny, could stand on both feet, there was no way to prove whether it met the requirements. However, the fairy tale animal, bunny, had proven that it could drive the bloody serpent. This was actually because of the fairy tale equipment's passive effect. Dake actually hid the fairy tale animal, bunny's ability to summon a recorded vehicle-type armed card to its side. Battle Stage 4. 30s. Before the round changed, the cute beast and lunar beast in Dake's field had already died under the black jade snake ball and tail whip. After the round changed, illusory beast, Ibu also unleashed its last bit of strength. After it released Wish on illusory beast, multiform, it was smashed to death by bloody serpent. The reason why it used receive on illusory beast, multiform, and not fairy tale animal, bunny, was naturally because the latter didn't need it. At this time, there were only 5+1 enchanted elves left in the field. Blue team, illusory beast, multiform, fairy tale animal, bunny. Red team, bloody serpent, totem pole, crypt plant, and a demon leech. In terms of numbers, the white Gouda had the upper hand. In terms of the overall situation, the white Gouda also had the upper hand. The bloody serpent, which was burning with blood, still had a strong deterrent effect. Although Light Messenger's wishful godly sword attracted a lot of attention, fairy tale animal bunny's evasive behavior had weakened the audience's expectations for wishful godly sword. The white Gouda kept ordering the bloody serpent to chase after bunny. His finger touched the top of the deck and consecutively drew 2 new enchanted cards. After taking a look, he immediately spread out one of the enchanted cards and suddenly summoned. In the name of the white Gouda, special summon, Dark Shadow Leech. Yes, he had drawn a second Dark Shadow Leech. At this time, the concentration of dark elements in the dark barrier had decreased due to the first special summon, but it still retained the ability to special summon a second one. The white Gouda didn't have any high-star enchanted elves that needed to be sacrificed. This special summon of Dark Shadow Leech was to rely on Dark Shadow Leech's movement ability to restrict Light Messenger's movement. Once it was slowed down, the bloody serpent would be able to deal a fatal blow to it. After only 3 seconds, the second Dark Shadow Leech was born in the vortex of dark elements and immediately dived into the shadows. The dark barrier, released by the totem pole, was only left with a very thin layer. It had basically lost its effect. At this time, on the other side of the blue team's platform, Dake had already drawn 2 new enchanted cards. Bliss Roar Moon Curly Ear. In this 4th round, Dake Dimming finally drew a second Bliss card, and it was the most powerful Bliss Roar Moon. It was a pity that Illusory Beast, Ibu and Luna Beast had been destroyed. Otherwise he could immediately obtain a new 6-star combat power. If it was Curly Ear, it could only evolve into a 5-star, Long-Eared Rabbit. Although Long-Eared Rabbit had the ability to threaten Bloody Serpent, it would be a waste to use Bliss Roar Moon to evolve it. And with the current situation there was no need for that. Dake already had a plan in mind. He still chose to observe and leave the battle to Illusory Beast, Changeable Monster, and Fairy Tale Animal, Little Rabbit. Bloody Serpent. S magic power is 4,500 points. With Giant Beast's passive bonus it can reach 5,000 points. Wishful Divine Sword has a passive bonus of plus 500 attack. Lightbringer only needs to convert 2,000 points of attack to increase its attack to 5,000 points. Time required, 20 seconds. If it's safe, there's nothing to ask for. Bang! At this time the Dark Barrier's last remnant was destroyed by the Lightbringer's elbow. The Dark Shadow Leech's body was suddenly exposed as the shadows faded away. But in the blink of an eye, it jumped into the Lightbringer's shadow again. However, the Lightbringer suddenly turned around, and the giant sword that was burning with golden flames shone behind it. The giant shadow was instantly dispersed, and the Dark Shadow Leech was exposed again before it could react. Then the Lightbringer's sword lightly pierced through the Dark Shadow Leech. This was the Lightbringer's first attack after summoning the Wishful Divine Sword. The Dark Shadow Leech, which only had 1,800 points of magic power, didn't even have time to react before it was killed on the spot. Bang! White Gouda slammed his fist on the table and took a deep breath. He was deeply regretful. Although the Lightbringer didn't attack, the aura that it released was at least at the 2nd rank. The Dark Shadow Demon Leech was a super fragile monster with only 100 points of defense. Therefore, it was not surprising that it was killed in one hit by a 2nd-tier Elven Mage with a weapon. The problem was that he was too eager to kill the Fairy Tale Animal Little Rabbit. So he ordered it to stop the Dark Shadow Leech, which led to the Dark Shadow Leech's death. This move could be said to be extremely bad. It was a completely unnecessary mistake. However, this seemingly innocuous episode also showed the Lightbringer's the Fairy Tale Animal Little Rabbit great adaptability. This harmless 2-star magic guiding fairy had overturned his understanding time and time again. After killing the Dark Shadow Leech, the little rabbit became even more arrogant, and its laughter almost made his teeth shatter. His mentality was completely out of balance. Crypt Grass. Finally, White Gouda ordered the Crypt Grass that was hiding under the ground. At this moment, the bloody flames on the Bloody Serpent's body started to fade. The Fantasy Beast monster was still trying its best to stop the Bloody Serpent from moving. The Lightbringer had a huge body, but it was laughing and jumping around like a rabbit. Finally, it stepped on one of the Crypt Grass's underground traps. At that moment the Crypt Grass's mouth suddenly opened. The Lightbringer's left foot stepped down, and it fell into the Crypt Grass's mouth. Then this 3-star magic elf closed the cage and bit the Lightbringer's left foot. The Fairy Tale Animal Little Rabbit, in the Lightbringer's cockpit, was covered in cold sweat, and the laughing mask that it had lost seemed to come back to its senses. People who couldn't see through the cage couldn't imagine how close it was to death at that moment. The moment the Crypt Grass bit it, the Fairy Tale Animal Little Rabbit's remaining mana was even lower than when it took the fatal throw from the Oxhead Axeman head-on. Because of this, the tone of its wild laughter changed for a moment. However, other than the rabbit and Dake, no one else noticed. No one knew that the Lightbringer that looked big was actually as fragile as a thin piece of paper. Since no one noticed, it was as if it didn't happen. Meow. The Fairy Tale Animal Little Rabbit wiped its sweat with its short hand and let out a long sigh. But after that moment, the shadow of the Bloody Serpent shrouded it. The blood mist that surrounded the Bloody Serpent corroded its surface first. The acid from the Crypt Grass's mouth was corroding its left foot. The fairy tale animal Little Rabbit. S mana was going back and forth between the limit and the limit every second. Roar! The bloody serpent carried the last remaining bloody flame and slammed into the Lightbringer that was bitten by the crypt grass. The fantasy beast variety monster couldn't completely lock the bloody serpent's movements. The stinky wind attacked. The white Gouda's face showed a slightly hideous smile. The fairy tale animal Little Rabbit's laughter disappeared. The Lightbringer used its waist as an axis and suddenly turned around at that moment. After raising its head, it instantly met the bloody serpent's huge snake eyes. Both of them had the same thought in their eyes: death. Roar! The world moved. The sound was restored. The fairy tale animal Little Rabbit made a gesture of turning around and unsheathing its sword. The Lightbringer lifted the wishful godly sword instantly, and like a well-trained warrior, it slashed at the bloody serpent that was charging at it like a train. The golden-red flame on the sword suddenly rose and boiled, making the wishful godly sword, which was already very thick and long, look even thicker and longer. As the flame flashed, the blade of the sword lit up. The bloody serpent, which had 3,000 points of defense, was like a piece of tofu pudding when it touched the blade of the sword. It didn't even have the slightest impact on the blade of the sword. The bloody serpent's head was cut into two halves by the sword light. The fiercer the bloody serpent was, the faster it was cut into two halves. The force of the head-on collision was completely negated. The huge bloody serpent, which had a circumference of a few meters, was cut into two halves by the sword. The bloody serpent's momentum stopped, and the front half of its body that was cut into two halves suddenly fell down. However, before its body hit the ground, it melted in the air. The terrifyingly huge body turned into countless magic light spots in the night wind that had lost its stench. It was like a sea of stars that reflected the bright stars in the night sky. The white Gouda suffocated at that moment. No one could understand what had happened. The audience thought that the bloody serpent had seized the opportunity to kill the fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit. However, in the next second, they realized that it had been cut into two halves by the pink furry rabbit. The stadium returned to silence. However, this silence only lasted for less than half a second. It was completely destroyed by the surprise, shock, and cheers of the tens of thousands of audience members. Yvette revealed a sincere smile amidst the tsunami-like cheers. Alphalia looked at the white Gouda on the red team's platform worriedly. Professor She-Urfa stared at the white Gouda's expression closely. The moment the fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit, retracted its hand, it stabbed at the crypt that bit its left foot. The split body of the crypt plant was pierced by the sword and turned into magic power that dissipated. The disappeared ground returned to normal and pushed the light messenger's left foot back. The fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit's shrill laughter echoed in the night sky again. A snow-white light fell from the sky. The fantasy beast, ever-changing monster, bathed in the light of wish, and quickly recovered its magic power. On the blue team's platform, Dake Dimming suddenly raised his head, and a golden light appeared in his green eyes. The Eye of Truth quietly opened. His gaze was also fixed on the white Gouda on the red team's platform, just like Professor She-Urfa's. At this moment, the audience's gaze was divided into three. Most people were looking at the light messenger, but there were also people looking at the two players on the platform, trying to catch the changes in their expressions. The commentator only spoke after a long while. Dake Dimming was neither happy nor sad. White Gouda, on the other hand, seemed to have been petrified. I really didn't expect the white Gouda's 8-star magic guide sprite to leave the stage in such a way. The commentator's voice floated like a cloud. There was only a single digit left on the fourth round's countdown. Battle Stage 4. Zeros, drip. The moment the countdown reached 0, the sound of water droplets fell into one's heart. White Gouda's completely petrified expression changed in that instant. His eyelids suddenly twitched violently. His pitch-black pupils unnoticeably expanded outwards, causing the area occupied by the whites of his eyes to shrink correspondingly. He suddenly raised his hand and rubbed his cheeks. The corners of his mouth curled up a little as he rubbed his palms, but his expression became colder and colder. If one didn't pay special attention, this change wouldn't be easy to notice. However, people like Dake and Professor Earbook could see it very clearly. In the eye of truth's vision, there was a faint shadow floating behind White Gouda. Although Dake didn't know what it meant, he was certain that White Gouda's second consciousness had been activated. Looks like the plan is going well, Dake muttered silently. So my opponent has changed from White Gouda to you? However, in reality, White Gouda still retained his sense of self at this moment. He hadn't completely replaced his second consciousness yet. Battle Stage 5? 27s. No matter how surprised the audience was, the duel wouldn't be paused because of this. After confirming that White Gouda had changed, Dake casually drew a card. 2 new magic guide cards were added to his hand. Fairy Puppet. Bliss 3. I have to give him some space, don't I? Dake looked at the 2 cards in his hand, and then looked up at White Gouda. The red team still had Totem Pole, Cryptweed, and a Demon Leech on the field. However, Totem Pole was just a pole without Dark Ward, and Cryptweed only had 2/3 of its mana left, so it wasn't much of a threat. The last Demon Leech was only a 1-star sacrifice. This meant that Dake could end this duel if he wanted to. However, he had promised Professor Earbook that this duel would be serious, so he didn't give any new orders to Fairy Tale Animal, Bunny, and Fantasy Beast, Polymorph. Perhaps Fairy Tale Animal, Bunny and Fantasy Beast, Polymorph, were still immersed in the joy of finally eliminating the Bloody Serpent, so they didn't do anything substantial. Under such circumstances, Dake noticed that the White Gouda's expression suddenly changed when he looked at the 2 new magic guide cards. At that moment, a black tide surged out from the depths of his eyes and completely covered his consciousness. This kind of coverage was completely different from Angus Jeffrey's situation. White Gouda's main consciousness wasn't dormant. It was just like a thin veil covering his main consciousness. He didn't feel much, but he was actually being controlled by his second consciousness. The huge doubts he had when he saw the 2 new magic cards vanished into thin air after being replaced by the second consciousness. White Gouda narrowed his eyes and looked at the opposite side. Then he slowly said in a cold voice, "The game has just begun." The atmosphere instantly exploded. "In the name of White Gouda, I offer a Demon Leech and a Totem Monster as sacrifices." White Gouda's aura changed abruptly. His eyes were cold and his temperament was awe-inspiring. He took out a card from his hand and held it up high. He actually began to cast the sacrificial summoning spell on the spot. It was completely different from before. His mastery of the sacrificial summoning spell had broken through to a new level. It was unusually smooth when he cast it. In the red half of the zone, the Demon Leech, that was hiding in the shadows, and the Totem Monster, that had been standing in the summoning zone all along, turned into a beam of light that shot up into the sky under the guidance of the sacrificial summoning spell. White Gouda called out the name of the magic guide card in his hand. Sacrificial Summoning. Demon General Habakkuk. A huge and complicated sacrificial summoning circle appeared right above the red summoning zone. Dark and twisted smoke slowly rose from the sacrificial summoning circle. A skinny and handsome humanoid demon general appeared in the center of the summoning circle. It was a magic guide spirit with a unique name. Based on the number of sacrifices, it should be a 4-star magic guide spirit. Demon General Habakkuk had a white face and no beard. It had a high nose bridge, green eyes, and golden red hair. Its ears were slightly shorter than the elf's long ears, but they were still longer than a human's. One of its ears was pierced with a ruby stud. It appeared with one knee on the ground. When it raised its head, it opened its mouth and revealed its sharp fangs. It was a vampire. 4-star vampire? Dake frowned slightly. He was sure that the White Gouda had never summoned this magic guide spirit. He didn't think that the White Gouda would have kept such a trump card in its duel with AI Mametis and Saraswati. Then there was only one possibility left. This wasn't a magic guide card that he made. Dake instantly realized that this might be the reason why the White Gouda's expression changed drastically when it saw the new magic guide card. He drew a magic guide card that didn't belong to him from his deck. Then the second consciousness invaded his mind and took control of his body. This duel, in a true sense, had just begun. Habakkuk. In the audience, Archbishop Caleb Norris, who was sitting next to the eldest prince, lost control of his strength and crushed the armrest on his right. Prince Charles was splashed with wood shards. He was instantly alerted and turned sideways. Archbishop? Caleb Norris stared at the demon general, Habakkuk, in the arena. The look in his eyes slowly disappeared. He finally took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "It's Habakkuk." Habakkuk. Prince Charles repeated the name and tried hard to recall. He had an impression of this name, but because he didn't experience the war, his impression was very shallow. It wasn't until Caleb Norris reminded him that he suddenly remembered that this was a general in the demon race's vampire army. The demon general. Habakkuk wasn't considered strong among the vampires, but it was extremely intelligent and had the potential to be a general. The 100 Races Alliance had once launched a plan called Decapitation Strategy, and the demon general, Habakkuk, was one of them. He had brought terrible losses to humans and the Alliance. He was once the nightmare of many humans. Of course, even if not strong, the demon general, Habakkuk, couldn't only be a 4-star. It was just that the magic guide spirits in the magic guide card didn't necessarily have the same strength as the real body. However, a magic guide spirit with a clear name could generally inherit some of the original body's abilities. The 4-star demon general, Habakkuk, was definitely not bad. Caleb Norris, of course, wouldn't consider this. After Angus Jeffrey mastered Demon King Armstrong, this hero's son also mastered Demon General Habakkuk. His low murmur was a little gloomy, and he was full of doubts about why this happened. Eldest Prince Charles, who was beside him, had an even purer thought. The hero's son has become a demon general of the demon race. Ha ha ha, he laughed. If the Archbishop wasn't beside him, he would have laughed out loud. Apart from Archbishop Caleb Norris, there were actually many people who could recognize the demon general, Habakkuk, at a glance. Arvette's expression also became solemn at this time. At this time, she had already seen some problems from some of the details in the field that weren't quite the same as a normal duel. However, because Dake didn't leak the matter of Into the Abyss, she couldn't deduce the answer out of nothing. Then she thought with some worry. Could this be related to the matter of Olga being invited? If it is, the seriousness of the matter will probably increase in an instant. Wait, isn't Ophelia in the academy? Or is it just a coincidence? Her thoughts became complicated. In the circular belt, Professor she sighed slightly. She knew that her judgment so far should be correct. White Gouda was indeed the third party. However, under this background, there were probably more things that could be dug out. She had a vague premonition. Next, let's see how far Dake can go. Thinking this, she couldn't help but turn her head to look in the direction of Ophelia Bullard. Could it be that she already knew? Her brows furrowed tightly as she thought of this. Ophelia Bullard, the Blood Belle, seemed to be wearing the mask of pain at this time. Judging from her performance, even if she didn't know the details, she probably already noticed some signs that couldn't be revealed to outsiders. Hephaestus Doragon opened his mouth and asked, "What's going on?" Ophelia didn't answer. Many times, many things were like this. Unpredictable, indescribable, and things didn't go as planned. Dake didn't know the name Habakkuk. He tried to understand the war between the demons and humans, but it was impossible for him to know the name of every demon general. Unfortunately, he didn't know anything about Demon General Habakkuk. However, it was this situation that made his smile grow wider. In this kind of duel that had nothing to do with life and death, he always liked to experience the unknown. The unknown brought fear, but it also brought joy. He pressed a fairy puppet and connected it to the light messenger, adding a new layer of insurance to the light messenger's existence. Then he finally issued an attack order to fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit, in the light messenger. Kill it. There weren't any miscellaneous things in the room. Luminous Emissary only had one sure kill skill, and only one method of attack. If the sword couldn't kill the opponent, it would be killed by the opponent. Mimimi. Fairy tale animal Little Rabbit laughed wildly in response. Then it raised the wishful sword and charged at Demon General Habakkuk. Crypt Grass. White Gouda didn't panic at all as he gave a hint. Then he took out another magic card and quickly summoned it. Crypt Plant, still had 2 more crypt traps. He could use 1 more crypt trap to slow down Light Messenger. Using this time, Demon General Habakkuk was able to display its special ability. Card name, Demon General Habakkuk. Type, Fairy card. Level, **********. Race, Undying. Attribute, Dark. Magic power, 2400. Attack, 1600. Defense, 1300. Ultimate skill, Vampire Army Blood Sacrifice Ritual, Atomization. The Last Survivor, Demon General Habakkuk, was a genuine gold card. As a vampire, it was basically an undead species or a demon species. The difference between these two species was actually quite vague. As for its attribute, it was naturally the dark attribute. However, as a 4-star magic fairy card, Demon General Habakkuk only had outstanding magic power. Its attack and defense were extremely weak. At a glance, it was obvious that it wasn't a magic fairy that was hard to deal with. Instead, it was more of a functional type. While Cryptgrass was stalling for time with its crypt traps, Demon General Habakkuk drew a blood array in the center of the red team's summoning area. It only used a few strokes to draw the outline of the array. Then, Demon General Habakkuk used Cryptgrass as a sacrifice for blood sacrifice ritual. At this moment, the crypt plant had once again lured the Lightbringer into the split crypt trap. Although the split part was immediately destroyed, it did successfully by some time. Demon General Habakkuk offered the last 1/3 of crypt grass to the ancestor of the vampires, at least in concept. Then blood quickly gushed out from the blood sacrifice ritual and formed a human shape. On the red team's platform, in the middle of the white Gouda deck, a magic card automatically flew out. On the blood sacrifice ritual, the human shape formed by the blood suddenly appeared. A 6-star vampire suddenly broke through the blood and was summoned by Demon General Habakkuk in a very special way. This vampire had blonde hair and red eyes. It wore a dark red tuxedo and a pair of pure white gloves. It looked more noble than Demon General Habakkuk. Its face was also very handsome, but its overly protruding aquiline nose ruined the harmony of its facial features. When it was summoned, it looked at Demon General Habakkuk coldly. Then, it pressed its hand on the hilt of its rapier and maintained its unsheathed posture as it charged at the 6-meter-tall Light Messenger. Card name, Vampire Viscount. Type, Fairy card. Level, Race, Undying. Attribute, Dark. Magic power, 2800. Attack, 2900. Defense, 1900. Ultimate skills, Phantom Rapier, Crimson Eye, Cold Blood Rage. This Vampire Viscount wasn't a famous magic fairy. Its stats were considered outstanding among the 6-star magic fairies. As for his sure-kill skills, he had 3. But before that, Vampire Viscount's magic power, attack, and defense were all increased by 300 points under Demon General Habakkuk's ultimate skill, Vampire Legion. 3100, 3200, 2200. Then when the Phantom Rapier was unsheathed, Vampire Viscount's attack would increase by 500 points. Even if the rapier was in the sheath, it could still activate its additional skill, Phantom Rapier. The Vampire Viscount's figure suddenly blurred as it charged at Light Messenger. In the next moment, it split into 2. The 2 doppelgangers, one on the left and one on the right, quickly moved towards Light Messenger's side. The real body was like a phantom, swapping positions with the doppelgangers. In the blink of an eye, the real body and the doppelgangers surrounded Light Messenger. The Vampire Viscount twisted its wrist. Then, together with the 2 doppelgangers, it instantly pulled out its sword. 3 sword lights slashed out at the same time. I'm done. 10,000 words. 5th update completed. Brothers, cast your monthly votes and razor blades. Chapter 728. White Gouda didn't know that his deck was completely different from when he was in the finals of the Silver Cup. But at this moment, the second consciousness was in control, and his own consciousness was suppressed. He could only watch as if he was in a dream, and naturally accept this development. Finally, after returning, he forgot the process as if he had woken up from a dream, and accepted the result as an established fact. The second consciousness was far superior to White Gouda in terms of magic control, understanding of the deck, and control of the duel. When the bloody serpent was cut in half by the light messenger, White Gouda's mind went blank. However, his second consciousness immediately analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of the light messenger, and he quickly thought of a way to deal with it. He controlled Demon General Habakkuk to use blood sacrifice ritual to summon Vampire Viscount from the deck. Of course, he didn't do it for no reason. Relying on the blood sacrifice ritual, Demon General Habakkuk only needed half of the sacrifice to summon a vampire from his hand or deck. In Werthergod's deck, the Vampire Viscount wasn't the only Vampire Viscount that fit the criteria. He chose it because it could counter Light Messenger. The second consciousness still referred to himself as White Gouda. White Gouda focused his eyes and looked at the Vampire Viscount with a cold expression. Remember, https://m, VIP can't you? VIP. That vehicle-type weapon's attack is very powerful, but its defense is weak. It's limited by its body, and its sword technique isn't that good. When it turns around, it will be a bit stiff. The Vampire Viscount can use Phantom Sword technique to split into 3 attacks and use Shift to dodge the first attack. His idea wasn't wrong, and his goal was very clear. The Vampire Viscount fulfilled his request very well. The 3 sword lights slashed out at the same time, and the light envoy that was surrounded could only swing out 1 sword. Even though the Vampire Viscount's sword swept across and instantly destroyed 2 of the phantoms, the Vampire Viscount managed to move his main body to the position of the last phantoms in time. Finally, the Light Messenger was able to unleash his full power with his sword. That sword attack could reach 3,700 points after being stacked up. If it hit, it could instantly kill the Light Messenger. However, White Gouda didn't let down his guard. From the start of the duel until now, he had a deep understanding of how powerful his opponent was. Now that he had made his move, it was finally his opponent's turn. The Vampire Viscount only had 1 last sword energy left, and it flew out like a hot knife through butter. Just as the sword energy was about to touch the Light Messenger's Light Messenger, the Light Messenger, which was supposed to look, it disappeared. That sword light slashed through the light envoy's afterimage, and then with a bang, it struck a piece of wood. The Light Messenger's main body instantly activated the flash spell and was teleported out of the danger zone. After the Vampire Viscount missed his attack, he suddenly turned his head, and the Light Messenger's huge figure appeared in his eyes again. It was teleported behind Demon General Habakkuk. This was no doubt an unexpected surprise. Me, fairy tale animal Little Rabbit's laughter was still sharp, and it was too excited to finish its sentence. The wishful godly sword that was burning with golden red flames instantly broke through Demon General Habakkuk's clothes. Boom! Demon General Habakkuk's body exploded at that moment, and the blood mist formed after atomization rushed toward the Light Messenger behind him. However, the wishful godly sword still cut through the blood mist, and the golden red flames burned a large part of the mist. The flames and storms created by the flames even forced the remaining blood mist away. Demon General Habakkuk's pale face appeared from the remaining blood mist, and it was like a ghost that couldn't condense into a body. However, it didn't die. On the blue side's platform, Dake finally frowned. Light Messenger's attack power was as high as 5,500. Even if Demon General Habakkuk used atomization to avoid the most direct attack, it should have been burned to ashes by the golden red flames. However, it was still alive. Mimimi. Fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit, suddenly stepped forward, and in the midst of its maniacal laughter, it swung its sword a second time at the remaining blood mist. Its reaction was extremely fast, and Demon General Habakkuk didn't even have time to react before it was burned to ashes by the sword. However, it still didn't die. Even though Demon General Habakkuk's final remnant was an extremely blurry and translucent soul, it was still alive, and it even let out a terrifying laugh at Light Messenger. What's the reason? Dake's face was filled with shock, and he quickly thought of the possibilities that could have caused this phenomenon. Kettle, S. Sturdy, and Doran Messiah, S. Holt could have guaranteed that they wouldn't be killed in one hit. However, Demon General, Bahacket, had already taken 2 hits. No, far more than 2 hits. Fairy tale animal Little Rabbit realized that it still couldn't kill Bahacket with its sword, so it quickly shook its giant sword and slashed at Demon General, Bahacket's remnant soul. However, even though Demon General, Bahacket's soul was constantly being slashed apart, it kept reforming, and just like its race, it displayed the shocking, undying ability. It continued to laugh, attracting fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit's attention. On the other side, Vampire Viscount, who had failed to decapitate its leader, went up against Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces. Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces, was still in its bloody serpent form, and its magic attack and defense were roughly 3,000/3, 500/3,000. Although it was far inferior to Bloody Serpent's true form, it was still enough to dominate the second tier. However, Vampire Viscount fiercely glared at Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces, and scarlet waves appeared in its eyes. 2 beams of blood-red light shot out, instantly hitting Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces, that was charging at it. Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces' huge body instantly froze under Bloody Eye's glare, and scarlet light covered its entire body, making it unable to move. Vampire Viscount's head remained motionless, and it raised the phantom rapier in its hand horizontally. Then it used 2 fingers of its left hand to clamp the blade of the rapier, and from the right to the left to the tip of the rapier, cold blood flowed out from between its fingers, covering the entire rapier. Sure kill technique. Cold-blooded rage. In that instant, the phantom stinger emitted a bone-chilling cold. Vampire Viscount suddenly exerted force under its feet, and this sudden burst of speed caused it to turn into an afterimage. Crimson Eye's stun effect disappeared because of its movement, but it accelerated first and took the initiative to stab Fantastical Beast, ever-changing monster, skin. The cold-blooded power spread in an instant, and the chill spread. Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces' body was covered with a layer of ice in the blink of an eye. The ice spread upward, and then covered half of its head. Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces' movements suddenly became as stiff as a frozen corpse. Vampire Viscount sneered, and the phantom rapier, in its hand madly stabbed, and each sword cut off Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces' magical power by several hundred points. The total of 3,000 points of magical power seemed to be a lot, but after a few stabs, it was already reduced to skin and blood. Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces, which didn't have any active killing moves, was finally no match for Vampire Viscount. However, even though the Vampire Viscount managed to kill the Fantasy Beast, multiform monster, it had also used up all 3 of its ultimate skills. Now it was only left with a blank slate. After a while, Fairy tale animal, Little Rabbit, still couldn't kill Demon General, Bahacket, and finally chose to give up. Then it turned its head and charged at Vampire Viscount. Tick. The sound of the round changing suddenly sounded. The duel entered the 6th round. At this time, the White Gouda still had 3 cards in its hand. Dake Dimming had 5 cards in his hand, and they were Dragon Bolito, Big Milk Jar, Bliss Moon, Curly Ear, Bliss 3. At this time, Dake finally didn't hold back anymore, and he really started to get serious. He reached out his hand and drew a card. With 2 new magic cards in his hand, Dake had a total of 7 cards in his hand. Underworld Soul Ring, Moon Pendant, Underworld Soul Ring, and Moon Pendant? Dake's mind raced. In the arena, the White Gouda still had a demon leech, hiding in the shadows. If Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces, wasn't destroyed, it could be captured and sacrificed to summon the 7-star Dragon Bolito. But with the current situation, it was no longer possible. Of course, if he wanted to forcefully summon Dragon Bolito, it was also possible. Curly Ear could use Bliss 3 to evolve into a 5-star long-eared rabbit, And with the addition of the 2-star fairy tale animal Little Rabbit, it would be a 7-star monster. But it was obviously a move that didn't make up for the losses. Dake would never do this unless he had no other choice. But with the current situation, it was imperative to summon Curly Ear. Dake slightly looked and saw that Demon General, Habakkuk, was using its speed to contend with Light User. And Light User was unable to match up to it. This was actually normal after all. Light User was just a weakened version. No matter how good fairy tale animal Little Rabbit's driving ability was, it couldn't allow Light User to exceed its body's limits. It was able to contend with the Bloody Serpent's tail mostly because Fantasy Beast, 100 Faces, was holding it back. Now that it was a one-on-one battle, it was obviously at a disadvantage. But the wishful godly sword was awe-inspiring, and Demon General, Habakkuk, didn't have a sure kill skill, so it didn't dare to move an inch forward. Thus it was a stalemate. Even so, it was only a stalemate for a few seconds. But this stalemate only lasted for a few seconds, and the situation could be seen. Whether it was Dake Dimung or White Gouda, both of them already had a plan in mind. Dake didn't hesitate too much and opened his mouth to summon. In the name of Dake Dimung, I summon Curly Ear. Thus after fairy tale animal Little Rabbit, Cute Beast, and Moon God Beast, another furry rabbit was born. Curly Ear. As head, ears, and lower body had fluffy bundles of hair, as if it was wearing a hairband and a skirt. Compared to the other furry rabbits, it was a different kind of cuteness. But when the audience saw the first appearance of this magical elf, they were a little numb. At this point, no one would be bewitched by the appearance of these magical elves. On one hand they ridiculed, "Is this a rabbit deck?" On the other hand, they were faintly anticipating what kind of surprise this cute little rabbit would bring. On the red team's platform, White Gouda was very vigilant. Although he didn't know what abilities Curly Ear had, he was very clear that Dake wouldn't act without thinking. This Curly Ear must have something to counter. Vampire Viscount. With this in mind, after a slight delay, he very solemnly summoned a magical elf card. In the name of White Gouda, I summon Blood Demon Sandra. Blood Thrall, Blood Demon, and then Vampire. This was a sequence of species that was progressing step by step. After Vampire Viscount performed the embrace on certain creatures, he could turn them into blood thralls. Then, the blood thralls would continue to transform and become blood demons and then vampires. White Gouda once had a magical elf card called Blood Demon. But the blood demon he summoned now had a name, just like Demon General, Habakkuk. This was a 3-star magical elf card. When White Gouda summoned it, he already had a plan in mind. Blood Demon, Sandra, and Curly Ear were facing each other from a distance of 100 meters. Curly Ear, climbed up the stone wall and swayed in a circle. But before it could stand properly, a pink light sprinkled down. Dake had immediately activated Bliss 3. Curly Ear's body emitted the light of evolution. Its body quickly elongated in the light, and in the blink of an eye, it became extremely tall, like a sexy bunny girl. Long-eared Rabbit's level was only 5 stars, but its explosive power was extremely strong in a short period of time. It wasn't inferior to any 6-star magical elf. Most importantly, it had the speed that surpassed a Vampire Viscount. After completing its evolution, Long-eared Rabbit was no longer as confused as it was when it was still Curly Ear. It stared at the Vampire Viscount for 2 seconds, and suddenly exerted force under its feet. The stone wall instantly exploded, and smoke billowed as it shot out like an arrow. A whistling sound rang in their ears. From the blue half of the area to the red half of the area, a long line passed through in an instant. The Vampire Viscount, that was circling around, Light Messenger, suddenly turned its head and raised its sword to stab forward. However, Long-eared Rabbit's figure that was charging from the front twisted its body and dodged this amazing stab with shocking reflexes. Then, with a fragrant wind, it kicked the Vampire Viscount's chest. Boom! The Vampire Viscount's chest caved in at a speed visible to the naked eye. Its entire body stopped on the spot for a moment, and then it suddenly retreated. It was actually kicked out of the boundary of the arena. Before Blood Demon Sandra, in the red summoning area could stand still. It heard a whistling sound in its ears. The vampire Viscount had already flown away from its side. The alarm bell in White Gouda's mind rang. He suddenly released his magic power, and the red magic ball that was expelled from the ground because of the crypt plant's death flew into the air with a swoosh. He was shocked. If Long-Eared Rabbit's target was this magic ball, he might not be able to react at all. Furthermore, if Long-Eared Rabbit's first attack was Blood Demon Sandra, White Gouda pressed the cards in his hand with his left hand, and they quickly cooled down. As soon as the 6th round began, he suffered a critical hit. However, the vampire Viscount wasn't killed in one hit. He believed that Long-Eared Rabbit belonged to the type that was extremely fast but lacked attack power. Now the most important thing was to protect Blood Demon Sandra. He originally wanted to rely on Vampire Viscount to buy some time and wait until he had more cards in his hand. But now, it seemed that it would be difficult to achieve. He could only slightly advance his plan. Even if he wasn't sure if he could win, he could only gamble. In the name of White Gouda, I summon Blood of the Black Python. He opened a card in his hand and channeled his magic power into it while chanting quickly. The card named Blood of the Black Python was covered with a thick layer of black. It was slightly longer than 3 seconds. The blood of the black python emitted a black light, and a dazzling red color suddenly gushed out from the darkness and condensed into a drop of blood that was as bright as a gem in the air. This drop of blood was sometimes black and sometimes purple. It looked like it was in great pain, but it was also emitting a strong fragrance. White Gouda's eyes were dark. He raised his right hand and pointed at the blood of the black python. The blood of the black python shot toward the ground and shot into Blood Demon Sandra's head in the blink of an eye. Transformation enhancement is not your specialty, White Gouda said coldly, but there was a hint of arrogance in his voice. Blood Demon Sandra was a vampire with a name. In the real world, Sandra was a servant of a vampire count. There was a period of time when he was known as the Blood Demon, closest to vampire. This title sounded like human closest to God, but it wasn't a good title. The difference was between vampire and God. Blood demons could transform into vampires, and there were many examples of this since ancient times. The so-called blood demon, closest to vampire, was built on the premise that he couldn't transform into a vampire. Therefore, there was a hint of sarcasm in it. However, there was only a fine line between Blood Demon Sandra and vampires. White Gouda's Blood of the Black Python had the ability to help him cross this fine line. Blood Demon Sandra was tall, but he was originally quite skinny. His hair was messy, and his face was sharp. His skin was pale, and his eyes were dull. His back was hunched, and his 2 arms were hanging down. His fingers were extremely long, and his fingertips could even reach his knees. When the drop of blood of the black python dripped onto his forehead, Blood Demon Sandra suddenly opened his eyes wide. His dull eyes instantly condensed, and the color of blood filled his eyes. Dark purple veins appeared on his pale skin, and the muscles under his skin expanded crazily. In the blink of an eye, his thin and tall body turned into a muscular and majestic body. Then, 2 bat wings broke through his skin and extended out from his back. Red, black, and purple blood mist constantly seeped out of his body and surrounded him. Blood Demon Sandra looked up to the sky and roared, expressing the excitement of transforming into a vampire. Vampire Viscount. Under White Gouda's command, the Vampire Viscount quickly returned and blocked in front of Blood Demon Sandra. Vaguely, the 3 vampires on the battlefield emitted a special dark energy. At a slightly different place, Light Messenger and Long-Eared Rabbit both stopped moving. Light Messenger raised Wishful Divine Sword diagonally, and he was ready to cut his opponent in half. Long-Eared Rabbit was casting self-encouragement, and his body was already lit up with the light of his superpower. High-speed movement was ready. 2 against 2. After eliminating Demon General Habakkuk, the situation on the battlefield became even again. However, something unexpected happened all of a sudden. Behind the Vampire Viscount, Blood Demon Sandra had a vicious expression on her face. She suddenly jumped forward and grabbed the vampire Viscount's shoulder with her two thick arms. Then she lowered her head and pierced the skin on the vampire Viscount's neck with her sharp fangs. Fresh blood flowed out. Vampire Viscount's magic power dropped drastically. The scene of his companions killing each other caused an uproar outside the battlefield. Dake raised his head and looked at the white Gouda in front of him. However, he saw that the white Gouda's expression was cold, and he wasn't surprised at all. It was obvious that he had expected this. Vampire Viscount couldn't struggle under the white Gouda's command, and he could only let blood demon Sandra suck his blood dry. Even though he looked like he was in great pain, the white Gouda didn't show any mercy. After absorbing Vampire Viscount's blood demon Sandra's aura started to rise. The aura of Blacktail's blood, which had reached the second tier after absorbing Blacktail's blood, skyrocketed again. It looked like it was going to break through the barrier between the second tier and the third tier. The magic power of the Vampire Viscount had been exhausted. Its body withered and dissipated under everyone's gaze, turning into scattered magic light spots. Blood demon Sandra's aura had yet to reach its peak. However, in the next second, the white Gouda's eyes slightly sunk, and blood flames suddenly appeared on blood demon Sandra's body. Blood demon Sandra's magic power merged with the flames, and its skin gradually turned into a disgusting dark purple color. The right side of its forehead broke open, and a sharp horn that was as long as a finger appeared. The blood flames around its body merged with the power of Blacktail's blood, and it turned dark purple as well. Blood demon Sandra's aura had broken through the barrier and reached the third tier. Card name, Vampire, Sandra. Type, Elf card. Level, Race Fiend. Attribute, Dark/Poison magic power, 3800. Attack, 3900. Defense, 2300. Ultimate skills, Demon's Blood, Blacktail's Poison blood armament, Brutal Strength. After 2 consecutive breakthroughs, Blood demon Sandra had become an 8-star magic elf, Vampire, Sandra. Its 3 attributes might not be as good as Bloody Serpent, but it was better in other aspects. First was Demon's Blood. This passive ultimate skill had an obvious source, and it increased Vampire, Sandra's magic attack and defense by 500 points each. Then under the effect of Demon General, Habakkuk's ultimate skill, Vampire Army, its 3 attributes increased by 300 points each. Its 3 attributes reached a terrifying 4, 600/4, 700/3, 100. Bang! Vampire, Sandra, suddenly raised its hands and crossed its arms in front of its chest. Long-eared Rabbit's figure suddenly appeared after that, and the surprise kick was blocked by its arms. After absorbing Vampire Viscount, Vampire, Sandra's speed skyrocketed. Although it was still not as fast as Long-eared Rabbit's high-speed movement state, it could barely keep up. Roar! After blocking Long-eared Rabbit's surprise attack, it roared and suddenly pulled out its sharp claws with dark purple nails, trying to grab Long-eared Rabbit's ankle. However, Long-eared Rabbit crossed its legs and borrowed strength from its arms. After its attack failed, it quickly fled. Vampire, Sandra, took a step forward and was about to chase after it, but its expression suddenly trembled, and it closed its eyes on the spot. On the red team's platform, White Gouda's smile was cold. He also closed his eyes at that moment, and then opened them again like a normal blink. Vampire, Sandra did the same. However, in that instant, Vampire, Sandra's eyes were completely different. Its incomparably violent aura also abruptly calmed down. I see. Dake Dimming lightly tapped his eyebrows, and in the eye of truth's vision, a blurry black shadow also appeared behind Vampire, Sandra. White's second consciousness personally came down. Then he looked at Long-eared Rabbit, with a slightly worried expression. Long-eared Rabbit stopped on top of a broken stone pillar, and its feet were already dyed purple. It was the blacktail poison. The dark purple poison started to spread from its feet, and although the speed was not fast, it was constantly depleting its magic power. Long-eared Rabbit's time was running out. Me, Long-eared Rabbit, suddenly raised its head and called out in Dake Diming's direction. Dake did not hesitate and decisively took out Moon Pendant. In the name of Dake Dimming, I summon Moon Pendant. The pendant emitting moonlight appeared in front of Long-Eared Rabbit's chest. It suddenly reached out and grabbed the pendant, wearing it on its neck, and its curved eyes revealed a hint of charm. Charm +2, obtained a Surekill skill. Beauty under the moon, beauty under the moon. Sometimes mesmerizes the opposite sex that comes in contact with you. Success rate increases when using charm-type abilities. Under the moonlight, the effect of Moon Pendant is doubled. Long-Eared Rabbit already had the Surekill skill body of charm, and now that it wore the Moon Pendant and was bathed in moonlight, its charm instantly doubled. Then, it pursed its lips and suddenly exerted force on its feet, leaving only an afterimage on the spot. It charged towards Vampire Sandra in a straight line. Long-Eared Rabbit was not only fearless when it killed an 8-star magic guide elf with its 5-star body, but it even bloomed with a bright smile. Although the blacktail poison weakened its magic power, it could not deprive it of its will. Once again it came into contact with Vampire Sandra, and it did not retreat anymore. Lightbringer, who was charging towards Vampire Sandra, suddenly stopped. This was a duel that advocated fighting in groups, and it created space for Lightbringer to fight with Vampire Sandra one-on-one in this duel ground. Tick. The sound of the turn changing did not affect its movements. Long-Eared Rabbit launched a storm-like attack on Vampire Sandra. White Goat's second consciousness was multitasking. He drew cards while controlling Vampire Sandra to attack. His eyebrows, which seemed to be frozen, gradually frowned. A magic guide elf was just a magic guide elf. He thought that after he projected his consciousness into the Long-Eared Rabbit, he could rely on his superb skills to further increase his strength advantage. He did not expect the Long-Eared Rabbit's attacks to be so flexible. His speed was not slow, but he still could not touch the Long-Eared Rabbit's fur. If he did not have the blacktail poison all over his body, he would have been tortured to death. This thought suddenly appeared, and it could no longer be suppressed. A strong sense of shame gushed out from the bottom of his heart. At this moment, this second consciousness seemed to finally understand some of White Gouda's feelings. In the next moment, Vampire Sandra and White Gouda's cheeks turned red at the same time. Vampire Sandra's movement suddenly froze, and the Long-Eared Rabbit instantly broke through its defense. The Long-Eared Rabbit's feet kept enlarging in its eyes. Bang! Vampire Sandra was kicked to the ground. Although it did not lose much mana, the redness on its face became more obvious. The Long-Eared Rabbit then let out a bell-like laugh. It did not care that half of its mana was consumed by the poison, and it continued to beat up Vampire Sandra. An 8-star magic guide elf could not fight back at all. On the red side's platform, White Gouda's face was also red. His eyes were fixed on the Long-Eared Rabbit in the center of the platform. As if he was possessed by the wind, his emotions were burning. He wanted to jump off the platform immediately and rub his body against the Long-Eared Rabbit. Very few people noticed this change in White Gouda. Even if they noticed, they would not be able to figure out the reason. However, Dark, who felt something in his heart, couldn't help but laugh out loud after drawing the card. He had been holding back for a long time in this duel, but his self-control had been cultivated, and he should not have laughed. But the scene in front of him had exceeded his limits. Ha! That laughter was transmitted through the loudspeaker. Fortunately, White Gouda only had eyes for the Long-Eared Rabbit. He only heard the laughter vaguely, so he did not explode. But was this really a good thing? Dake saw that although he drew his card, he did not look at it. He shook his head and looked at his own card with a smile. Mina's Fantasy Beast, Ibu Mina's, and the second Fantasy Beast, Ibu. When Dake entered the 7th round, he had already started to summon, because there was only one choice, and that was to summon Fantasy Beast, Ibu. The Long-Eared Rabbit was deeply poisoned, and there was no time to delay. But although the blacktail poison's priority was very high, its damage was only average. Ibu, prayer, Long-Eared Rabbit. Receive Fantasy Beast Ibu. After giving out 2 commands in 3 seconds, Dake immediately summoned for the 2nd round. In the name of Dake Dimung, I summon Underworld Soul Ring. The Underworld Soul Ring suddenly appeared and wrapped around Demon General Habakkuk's remnant soul. Fantasy Beast. Ibu returned to the magic card. Fantasy Beast. Ibu reappeared where it had disappeared. Long-eared Rabbit was still suppressing Vampire Sandra. But Vampire Sandra was a third-tier magic fairy after all. It forcefully woke up in the middle of the battle and was once again enchanted. Dake only glanced at it and immediately used the sacrificial summoning technique. In the name of Dake Dimung, I offer Demon General Habakkuk and Fantasy Beast Ibu as sacrificial offerings. Sacrificial summoning minus. He had 2 7-star magic fairies in his hand. Dulong Baluto's strength was obviously higher than minus S. However, if he wanted to bring more smiles to this duel, Minas was undoubtedly the best choice. In the end, Demon General Habakkuk, who would not be destroyed as long as there were other vampires on the battlefield, was completely eliminated as a sacrificial offering. Dake's luck was not bad. This sacrificial summoning, which had a high failure rate, actually succeeded. Under the moonlight, Minas exuded an astonishing charm. Even the long-eared rabbit, with the moon pendant, seemed to be inferior. Its appearance instantly attracted a lot of attention. But at this moment, the battle between long-eared rabbit and vampire Sandra was indeed more exciting. Under such circumstances, Minas raised its head and used its ultimate skill, Moon Guard, at the long-eared rabbit's area. Moon Guard could protect itself and its companions from falling into a state of confusion, drowsiness, burning, freezing, and other abnormal states for 5 rounds. Under the moonlight, the duration would be doubled, and it would be purified. Accompanied by Minas' melodious cry, the moon in the night sky seemed to be brighter. The moonlight from the sky poured down on the red half of the battlefield, bathing fairy tale animal, bunny and long-eared rabbit, in a watery moonlight. The long-eared rabbit's poison on long-eared rabbit's body faded at an incredible speed. If the White Gouda's second consciousness was awake, it would definitely cry out in shock. Whitesnake's poison was once known as an incurable poison. He would never have thought that Whitesnake's poison would be purified by Medusa's moon guard. But it was nighttime after all. The moonlight was beautiful. After that, Minas used Life Water Stream again. Long-eared rabbit's precarious mana was finally replenished a little. Then the one-sided fierce battle between the 5-star and 8-star magic guide fairies continued. On the red team platform, Werther God suddenly let out a miserable cry. His consciousness was awake again, and he tried to summon and activate a magic guide card in his hand. The part of Vampire Sandra's consciousness that was projected on her body finally woke up. At that moment, it did not think of anything and immediately executed its last order when it was awake. It used its ultimate skill, Blood Origin Armament. It had 4 ultimate skills and the last one was Brutal Force, which could greatly increase its attack power in a short period of time. However, this simple ultimate skill did not have the slightest bit of bravery at this moment. If it could not hit its opponent, what was the use of having a high attack power? Therefore, it decisively chose Blood Origin Armament. Then, the purple flames burning on its body suddenly condensed into an exquisite armor that stuck closely to its skin. In its right hand, there was also a purple longsword. Of course, it did not need the longsword. What it really needed was the armor to increase its defense. Long-eared rabbit's attack power was as high as 3,300 points under the self-encouragement buff, but Vampire Sandra's defense had accumulated to 3,100 points before. Long-eared rabbit chose speed and sacrificed strength to attack. Every time it was injured, the amount of mana it lost was very limited. However, as Demon General Habakkuk was sacrificed, the aura of Vampire Army completely disappeared and Vampire Sandra's defense was only left with 2,800 points. Only after wearing the Blood Origin Armament's armor could it recover its defense and even reach an even higher 3,300 points. Blood Origin Armament was a full body armor. After wearing it, only a pair of eyes and some hollowed out parts of the body would be exposed. the defense of the joints would be weaker. It would be difficult for Long-Eared Rabbit to hurt it again. And if it was lucky, this armor might be able to block the charm effect. White Gouda's second consciousness thought so at first. Until it was charmed again, Long-Eared Rabbit accurately attacked Vampire Sandra through the hollowed-out parts of the armor. Relying on the high frequency of attacks, Vampire Sandra was tortured to death. The 8-star vampire that it controlled was killed by a 5-star pink rabbit in front of thousands of people. The second consciousness completely lost its mind. After a short pause, White Gouda closed its eyes and opened its eyes. The black tide receded, and its eyes were blank. Sunwon Fifth Watch. I went to the hospital yesterday and took a nap after that. My head is buzzing, and it's been very cute. Zizi, I'm so tired. My teeth suddenly hurt. I can't take it anymore. I'm going to sleep. I can't confirm when the new chapter will be updated today. I can only say that I'm going to be a daddy soon. Chapter 729. The change in White Gouda's expression did not escape Dake's eyes. From the perspective of the Eye of Truth, the blurry shadow behind White Gouda suddenly collapsed and disappeared. Then White Gouda opened her eyes in a daze. Dake took about 3 seconds to sort out his thoughts. Then his eyebrows twitched as he had a bad feeling. Oh no! According to his original plan, what he needed to do was to put as much pressure on the White Gouda as possible in this duel. He needed to increase the White Gouda's desire to win step by step, and at the same time, make the White Gouda feel despair and stimulate the second consciousness. Although the implementation process was subtly different from the situation in the plan, fortunately, the final result was the same. After drawing out the second consciousness, he needed to conduct a more comprehensive observation through duels and gather as much useful information as possible. During this process, the most important thing was to not let the second consciousness notice anything amiss and lure it to do as it pleased. Originally, everything was going smoothly. Although the jackrabbit's attacks were ferocious, its DPS against Sandra was very limited. Even if it managed to kill Sandra, it would still take a long time for it to do so. Website. https://m. Vipcanchu. VIP. Since the White Gouda's second consciousness had already entered the arena, it must be aiming for victory. It would not give up because of such a small setback. This was just like the second consciousness of the main character, Muto Games, in the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark game. Every time, it would appear at the critical moment and turn the situation around. But occasionally, it would also perform Candlelight in the Wind. But now Dake finally realized that he was wrong. The White Gouda's second consciousness was much more fragile than he had expected. It couldn't even withstand such a small setback. Wasn't it just an 8-star vampire getting blown up by a 5-star furry rabbit? Wasn't he just going to be bewitched by the body of charm? It's not like it's a big deal. Isn't the life barrier of the magic conducting ball still intact? Right. Dake could not help but shake his head. He was just about to enjoy the duel, but he didn't expect it to be over already. Now that the second consciousness had left in a sorry state, it would be extremely difficult to provoke it out again. Since he couldn't trigger the second consciousness, there was no point in continuing this duel with the White Gouda. Let's end it. With that thought in mind, he ordered the magic guide fairies to attack the magic sphere. Now there was only one 1-star demon leech left in the red square. It was as good as nothing. The White Gouda was still in a state of confusion. The red magic conducting ball was in a completely defenseless state. Once its magic guiding fairy attacked, it would be impossible for it to block it. Minas, water cannon. Fairy tale animal rabbit. Wishful divine sword. Minas raised her slender neck under the moonlight and opened her mouth slightly at the red magic ball in the sky. Ice blue water elements quickly condensed in her mouth and spun, and compressed into a water ball that emitted terrifying waves. Then she suddenly shot it out. The thick water column instantly drowned the magic conducting ball. Fairy tale animal, rabbit, laughed maniacally and threw out a huge sword that was burning with golden flames. After the wishful divine sword was thrown out, it no longer had the special effect of absolute cut. However, The life enchantment of the magic conducting ball had no defense, so the difference was not big. Therefore, the sword crossed the sky, and flames pierced through the sky. Under the night sky where water and fire intertwined, the life enchantment of the red magic conducting ball suddenly shattered, and endless light scattered like glass. Battle ended. Beep! The referee's whistle finally woke the white Gouda up from his daze. He almost subconsciously looked at the cards in his hand, and what he saw were a few completely unfamiliar magic cards mixed in with the cards in his hand. As a result, Werthergod's thought process became stagnant. His logic circuit finally had a loophole. The abnormality that he had vaguely sensed for a long time now had evidence. Some unacceptable possibilities were surging in like a flood breaking through a dam. His face was deathly pale. The end of this duel was extremely abrupt, even in the eyes of the audience. Ever since Vampire, Sandra was enchanted by Long-Eared Rabbit. White Gouda's performance had been very bad. No, he didn't perform at all. The audience who had high hopes for him could only think that he was unlucky and drew a useless Joker card at the end of the duel. However, the battle between Long-Eared Rabbit and Vampire, Sandra, was indeed exciting. Most of the audience was still immersed in the shocking feat of 5-star Rabbit defeating 8-star Vampire, and they didn't think too much about what White Gouda had been doing during this time. This incredible battle ended well, and it wasn't bad. It just made people want to see more. In the end, White Gouda lost the duel without any struggle, and many people thought that he had accepted his fate. He probably thought that he couldn't win no matter what, right? It's possible. If I were him, I would probably have the same thought. The 8-star Bloody Serpent was killed with one strike, and the 8-star Vampire was tortured to death. If I were him, I would probably have the same thought. It's too hopeless. This is the difference between us. I've said before that this white guy is no match for our Dake. He actually dared to challenge Dake? He's just overestimating himself. It's possible for someone who doesn't know his limits to end up like this. Speaking of which, the one that killed the Bloody Serpent was an armed card, right? Didn't they say that the conditions to use the armed card were very strict? Why did that 2-star Rabbit? That's a 2-star. The 8-star Bloody Serpent was killed by a 2-star Pink Rabbit with one strike. If you didn't mention it, I would have forgotten that the core of that armed card was a 2-star Rabbit. If that's the case, then both of Werthergod's 8-star Magic Guide sprites were killed by low-star rabbits? Isn't that too tragic? Are you saying that Dake Diming's set of cards is a rabbit set? I don't think so. After all, there are other magic elves in there. I really didn't expect that. Those rabbits. He has never summoned those rabbits before, right? So Dake didn't use the set of cards that he was used to? Definitely not. If he used the set of cards that he was used to, wouldn't he be crushed? That would be so boring. Right? Yes. The audience's discussion was heard amidst the deafening applause. Some were criticizing the White Gouda, some were praising Dake, and some were seriously analyzing the details of this duel. The Demon General, Habakkuk, and Blood Fiend Sandra summoned by the White Gouda attracted a lot of attention. However, the White Gouda's defeat diverted people's attention away from the two magic elves, and focused more on the two pink rabbits that won the duel. Of course, with Angus Jeffrey's Demon General, Amu as a precedent, Demon General, Habakkuk, and Blood Fiend Sandra didn't mean much. In a sense, the early exit of the second consciousness was actually quite fortunate for the White Gouda. Although he had aggressively challenged Dark and ended up losing in such a humiliating manner, it was still better than summoning even more demons, magic elves. Otherwise, the Academy might have to activate the emergency system again. Even so, the White Gouda still attracted the attention of some people. Angus Jeffrey's father, Count Jeffrey. The head Archbishop of the Holy Church, Caleb Norris. After watching this duel, these two big shots were already aware of something. Because of his relationship with Angus Jeffrey, Count Jeffrey had a partial understanding of what had happened in the Academy. The Holy Church also started an investigation after Demon General Amu appeared. Therefore, Caleb Norris knew more, not less. For Caleb Norris, the appearance of Demon General Habakkuk and Blood Fiend Sandra was more surprising than Demon General Amu. Because Demon General Habakkuk and blood fiend Sandra, were both demons that appeared in the modern war. Thus, when he thought deeply, he caught more clues. However, this didn't have much meaning in comparison. This was because after the duel, Count Geoffrey had quietly appeared behind him. Eldest Prince Charles, who stayed out of it, was actually more interested in Dake, but he didn't mind taking a bite of the melon. Thus, the three of them left the duel arena together and entered a nearby holy church property. They sat down secretly to discuss. At the same time, although Yelvet wasn't too interested in what happened to White Gouda, Dake was also in the academy, so she couldn't not investigate. Compared to the three of them, if she wanted to find out the truth, she didn't need to trouble herself. In a sense, the Valkyrie who graduated from the Shungmalian Academy had always been part of the Shungmalian faction. Go and call Irene. Yelvet watched Dake go down from the stage before instructing Janice. Then she left the arena happily. She was in a good mood. As a parent, Blood Maiden Ophelia Bullard's face was extremely ugly. In the Shungmalian Academy, if there was anyone who knew more about White than Dake and Professor Shi-Erfu, it would be Ophelia Bullard. It was just that before tonight, Ophelia Bullard's information was actually limited. After all, she wasn't allowed to have too much contact with White. However, she was particularly sensitive to certain things, so she could quickly connect the dots. After watching this duel, she was even more convinced of the conjecture that she had subconsciously denied. Therefore, after the duel ended, she immediately got up and tried to get rid of Hephaestus Doragon, but failed. She hurriedly went to Professor Shi-Erfu's office. She was going to wait for Professor Shi-Erfu there. On the other side, the students didn't change much about tonight's duel, but they were venting their emotions to their heart's content. The second-year students of the Noble Academy were finally able to release their pent-up emotions after an entire day. Both the boys and girls were shouting Dake Diming's name, and a huge amount of solidarity was formed. The second-year students of the Night Academy were quite depressed after their ominous premonition became reality. Many people even started to complain about Werther God's overestimation of his capabilities. Originally, if today's duel ended with White Gouda winning the Silver Cup, the junior mages of the Night Academy might be happy for the rest of Christmas. Even though White still lost to Dake in the Gold Cup competition, it was only a normal win and loss. It didn't rise to the level of the Silver Cup competition. Now that this matter had come out, they would no longer be able to use the argument that the champion of the Silver Cup was the Night Academy to argue with the Noble Academy. Of course, some people admired White's courage because of this. In short, everyone had their own ideas, and so on and so forth. After all, tonight's duel was just a Gold Cup competition, and there was no commentator or host. Therefore, when Judy teleported over to interview him, Dake naturally rejected her. Judy was unhappy, but she couldn't do anything about it. She could only turn her head to look at the initiator of the duel. However, White Gouda looked too miserable at this moment. She wanted to laugh, but of course she didn't. However, considering White Gouda's current situation, it wasn't suitable for an interview, so she didn't add insult to injury. After all, Judy was such a gentle person. After Dark finished packing up the magic cards, he walked down from the platform. He only cancelled the Lightbringer summon and didn't recall the magic elves. When he walked down the stairs, the Menace had already swum over. The long-eared rabbit, who was immersed in the joy of battle, only reacted after a while and quickly followed. The fairy tale animal Little Rabbit, who was holding the tree stump, was the last to follow. The three magic elves followed their master and quickly disappeared at the entrance of the contestants' tunnel. Then, when there was no one around, Dark Diamond was surrounded and annihilated by the three magic elves that suddenly sped up. Before leaving the contestants' tunnel, Dake summoned the magic elves that he could quickly summon and let them move freely. Then he went straight to Professor Shi-Erfu's office. A cool breeze blew by his ear, and Professor Shi-Erfu's voice was transmitted to his ears. Although tonight's duel wasn't exciting enough, they had gained a lot from it. If the fourth person didn't exist, this incident would have finally come to an end. The professors would be able to relax and celebrate Christmas happily. The night sky was full of stars, and the shy moon was hidden. Dake walked on the dimly lit path, and behind him was the lively outdoor duel arena. A few minutes later, he arrived at Professor Shierfu's office and saw Ophelia and Hephaestus waiting outside. "Good evening, Auntie Brad, Auntie Doragon." Dake pressed his hand to his chest and greeted them with a smile. In fact, he was Ophelia Brad's savior, but after that, he rarely had the chance to meet Ophelia, so they weren't familiar with each other. Of course, Dake was very familiar with Victoria City, so he wasn't unfamiliar with Ophelia. After such a period of buffer, although Ophelia Brad's complexion still didn't look so good, she was finally someone who had walked out of a storm. On the surface, she had regained her calm. "Good evening, Dake. You're here tonight." She was grateful to Dake, so her attitude was very good. "So, what are you hiding from me?" Hephaestus Doragon immediately examined Dake's face with a sharp gaze. She was tall, and when she looked down at him with her hands on her chest, his heart trembled, and her fragrance assailed his nostrils. Dake had been through a lot, so he was no longer flustered in such a situation. He immediately smiled and said, "There are some things that Professor Shierfu asked me to help deal with. When the professor arrives, we'll know soon enough." Hephaestus Doragon straightened up, and her pretentious stern face melted like ice. Then she suddenly asked something that was completely unrelated to the current situation. "By the way, I heard that you've already sent an invitation to Panduola's ball?" Dake's body froze, and his expression stiffened slightly. Then he calmly and courteously said, "Yes, Senior Panduola has agreed." "You little brat." Hephaestus shook her head and said, "I also heard that last Christmas, it was Panduola who invited you? How can a girl invite a boy? Be careful next time." Dake. Oh. With this small interlude, Ophelia Brad's attitude was even more relaxed. The three of them chatted in a low voice for a while, and finally, Professor Shierfu appeared. "Come in." Professor Shierfu had already entered the office and opened the door from the inside. Dake walked behind him, and when he entered, he realized that there were many more people in the office than he had expected. First of all, White Gouda was naturally among them. Secondly, Professor Mitya and Sister Kalien were also inside. To Dake's surprise, Olga and Eve were also there. He stepped over the threshold, closed the door and locked it. When the door was locked, a gust of aura wafted over. Professor Shierfu had set up a wind barrier, and the entire office became a private room. "Everyone, have some tea." Professor Shierfu gestured for everyone to sit down, and picked up the teacups. "Happy Lantern Festival. It's a bit short today. I'll think of a way to connect it." Chapter 730. I'll do it. Dake took the teacup, picked up the teapot, and began to pour tea for everyone present. Professor Shierfu nodded slightly and sat back in his seat. Tonight's incident was still within expectations. Of course, there were also some unexpected things. Regarding these incidents that happened within the academy, the professors had always preferred to resolve them within the academy. In principle, the Shungmalian Academy did not belong to any country. It had its own discretion and did not need to be responsible to any country. It was just that the academy's anchor point was set at the border of the kingdom, and it had a lot of cooperation with the kingdom, so there would occasionally be compromises. However, if something like this happened too often, it would obviously have a negative impact on the academy's reputation. Therefore, they would do whatever they could. Like today's incident, if one didn't delve into the implications, there were actually only 2 victims on the surface. It was still uncertain whether White Gouda was a victim or not. Professor Shierfu was very rigorous when judging this kind of thing. Remember the website, VIP, can't you? 6. Although Werther God showed that he didn't know about the second consciousness, in that duel, Lucien didn't know anything about it. However, this did not rule out some kind of acting. Before the official investigation, it was impossible to determine what role he played in this incident. It's a pity that Ka Zaire is not here. Professor Shierfu couldn't help but rub his eyebrows. For this type of investigation, Professor Ka Zaire's mind-reading ability was very important. Unfortunately, Professor Ka Zaire's mind was no longer on this matter. Compared to the matter he was focused on, the current incident was just a small matter. However, there were still substitutes, Professor Shierfu looked up at Dake Dimming, who was pouring tea, and there was a hint of relief in his eyes. The atmosphere was still a little dull. Even though Dake poured a cup of tea for everyone, it didn't ease the tension. In the end, he sat down beside Eve and asked her a few questions in a low voice. He then learned that Eve had been sent here by Yvette, Eve and Ollie. Eve was the one in charge this time, and Ollie was just accompanying her. But as the wind-enchanted field closed, the connection between Eve and Aaron was also severed. She could only report to Arvette later. Of course, since Professor Shierfu had allowed them to follow him, it meant that he had tacitly approved of her leaking the information. In fact, if this matter was as bad as she thought, perhaps she would need the help of the kingdom. Dark had already guessed Professor Sylph's intentions after learning about Eve's visit. On this occasion, the one who shouldn't be sitting here the most was Hephaestus. However, since he was already here, it would not be good to chase him away. After all, Hephaestus was already half a professor, and could be considered one of them. Dake poured himself a cup of black tea, and took a whiff of its aroma. His gaze then turned to the White Gouda, who was sitting alone on a chair. White Gouda, who had just experienced a huge defeat in his life, was shaking his left leg nervously. Perhaps he hadn't connected the whole story to this incident, but he more or less sensed that he had fallen into a bad situation. The first thing he thought of was Luoboat's experience. Then, he guessed that he might have been possessed by a vampire. But after he left, he flipped through the card deck and card pack, and discovered that he had never seen them before. Yet they were inexplicably familiar and frightening. With the sudden isolation of the second consciousness, the existence of these magic cards could no longer be hidden. White knew that Luoboat had obtained several magic cards after the vampire possession incident. However, the magic cards in Luoboat's possession were on a completely different level compared to the dozens of magic cards in his hands. The more he looked, the more frightened he became. He vaguely felt an unknown fear shrouding his entire body. Before he could figure it out, Professor Shierfu appeared before him. He had become the target of scrutiny. Among the people present, there were 3 who knew nothing about this incident. However, Professor Shierfu obviously didn't intend to explain it to them. When the black tea in the cup was 1 centimeter below the edge of the cup, Professor Shierfu finally spoke. "Dake, get ready." She didn't say it explicitly, but Dake already understood. "In the name of Dake Dimming, I summon the fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye." Dake silently chanted the summon. The beautiful goddess who covered her third eye with her bangs materialized beside him. The fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, was actually celebrating with the pink rabbits before this. They didn't leave the duel hall, and were ready to watch another duel. However, it adjusted its state quickly. In the blink of an eye, it had already sat down beside Dake, looking very meticulous. The situation here was very clear. The fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, knew what its mission was as soon as it sat down. Dake didn't say anything. She had already looked at White Gouda, who was sitting in the prisoner's seat. White Gouda suddenly felt a sharp gaze on his cheeks. He quickly looked at the eyes of the fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, but all he saw was as clear as water and as cold as ice. White. Professor Shierfu's voice made him look away. He was a little nervous as he replied, "Professor." Professor Shierfu said sternly, "Do you know why you're sitting here?" White Gouda pressed his hands on his knees and slowly grasped his trousers. He then said in a low voice, "I don't know." Professor Shierfu glanced at the right hand of the fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, and suddenly said sternly, "I thought you were at least an honest child." White Gouda's body trembled. He subconsciously looked at Ophelia Bullard, who was sitting on the sofa, with a pleading gaze. However, the blood bell's face was even more serious than Professor Shierfu's. She didn't give him any response. White suddenly felt that he might have unconsciously made an unforgivable mistake. The nervousness in his heart became heavier and heavier. Gulp. He couldn't help but swallow his saliva and said, Could it be that I'm also possessed by something?" The fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, formed an O with her right index finger and thumb, indicating that White wasn't lying. Professor Shierfu sighed slightly and said, Then what do you think about being possessed by something? Victor thought hard and carefully gave 2 examples. Vampires? Brain fluid demon? Professor Shi-Erfu asked. You know about the brain fluid demon? White nodded and said, I think I know a little. Vern Morse was possessed by the brain fluid demon. Could it be that I did it? White suddenly exclaimed halfway through his sentence. Then he found that the whole room was quiet. Professor Shi-Erfu still had a straight face. Dake and his magic elf looked indifferent. Professor Midia's smile seemed to be wider. Sister Kalien didn't do much. Ophelia's face became gloomier. As for the other 3 people, he didn't know why they were here. White's observation skills were actually very strong. He quickly noticed a terrifying fact from the reactions of all parties. What happened to Vern Morse was most likely his doing. Then the reason why the Academy started the investigation that day was also because of me? Brain fluid demon. Demon creature. Magic card. Angus Jeffrey. Victor recalled the magic cards in his card bag, and once again captured an even more frightening fact. Then the matter with Angus Jeffrey, could it be that I was the one who did it? Although Angus Jeffrey's case wasn't made public, the students had a lot of guesses. In addition, he had left the academy for many days, so the rumors naturally spread. Many people had already equated what happened to Angus Jeffrey with what happened to Vern Morse, which was why Victor asked this question. However, Professor Shi-Erfu shook his head and said, You did it. You can't escape. If you didn't do it, you can't bear the responsibility. Cooperate well. Answer whatever I ask. White couldn't help but look at Ophelia Bradley again. This time, Ophelia finally reacted and nodded slightly at him. White felt a little relieved, but he still answered Professor Shi-Erfu's question nervously. This was an extremely long and arduous investigation. Professor Shi-Erfu's questions covered the entire semester. She questioned Victor in detail based on the timeline she got from Vern Morse and Angus Jeffrey. In particular, she focused on the incident at night. Now, with the experience provided by Angus Jeffrey, and the confirmation that White Gouda had a second consciousness, Professor Shi-Erfu's questions had an obvious logical line. During the questioning and answering, White Gouda's face became more and more unsightly. He finally knew why he would feel tired when he woke up early in the morning. There were even special times when he would feel dizzy and unsteady. That was a sign of excessive blood loss. White Gouda always added his own blood to the magic refining process. He treated this as a secret that was different from others. Of course, he couldn't draw a tube of blood every day. At most, he would drip a drop each time. But sometimes he would feel that he was not in good spirits. Now, during the questioning, he finally understood the reason. It turned out that he always woke up in the middle of the night, sneaked into the secret passage, and cultivated demons with Angus Jeffrey for experiments. During the busy night after night, Angus Jeffrey's spirit gradually became haggard. His physical condition gradually deteriorated, and the dark circles under his eyes became deeper and deeper. But he probably spent less time in the secret passage at night, and his physical condition was obviously better than Angus Jeffrey's, so the dark circles under his eyes weren't as deep, and his appearance didn't look too abnormal. Of course, the abnormality of excessive blood loss was difficult to subside. But perhaps it was because of his body's instinct. He subconsciously ate some food that replenished blood. He didn't like to eat that kind of food. Blood? After listening to the whole investigation, Dake pondered for a while, and suddenly had an idea. After a while he thought to himself, no wonder Angus Jeffrey could successfully cultivate a demon body using Into the Abyss as a reference, but I couldn't. Is it because I lack blood? Of course, the blood in this couldn't be any random blood. Dake knew very well that White's blood was special. Now that the Demon King's blood in Ophelia Brad's body had been removed, he was probably the only human with the Demon King's blood. The Demon King obtained almost all the characteristics and abilities of the demons by creating vessels. In a more scientific way, it is a walking gene bank. So if the Demon King escapes, it can recreate an entire demon race. White's bloodline is considered the second generation of the Demon King's blood. The purity of the blood is definitely not comparable to that of a normal vessel. The blood of a hero, the blood of a Demon King, and the two sides of light and darkness at the same time. This does seem like a characteristic that a protagonist should have. Dake continued to listen while thinking carefully. White's blood contains almost all the genes of the demons. It's probably necessary to cultivate the demons. Into the Abyss didn't mention this. Without the Demon King's blood, even if the knowledge in Into the Abyss is printed into a book, it won't be of much use. So, the value of that book is very limited. I can't ask for a drop or two of his blood every time I want to cultivate some demon body parts. Sigh. Then who wrote that book? Could it be that White's second consciousness wrote it himself? As more and more information flowed into his mind, Dake's train of thought was gradually completed. He finally had a general understanding of everything that had happened. Then he realized another problem. This problem was related to his premonition and conjecture all this time. First of all, he thought that White's second consciousness was likely to have a great origin, just like the Dark Game. The easiest candidate was undoubtedly the Demon King. Professor Earbook might have thought of this too, but she didn't directly point it out. Instead, she continued to beat around the bush to prove it. However, without awakening the second consciousness, this evidence was actually rather weak. However, the so-called solving the case turned out to be based on a bold assumption. Bold assumptions, careful verification. If White's second consciousness was the Demon King, then it involved a question. When was his second consciousness born? It couldn't have been after school started. The most correct judgment would be last Christmas. Because the devil died on Christmas Day last year. In other words, last Christmas, when they were still guessing where the Demon King would be and how he would be revived, the Demon King had actually quietly revived in White Gouda's body. Come to think of it, this was really a terrifying feeling. If the Demon King didn't become retarded, White's consciousness would probably be invaded on the spot. No, in the original game, this might be a bad ending. And there must be a way to solve this problem. Therefore, although White became the Demon King's vessel, he wouldn't be invaded by the Demon King's consciousness. The subsequent plot was likely to revolve around his entanglement with the Demon King's consciousness. Of course, the Demon King wouldn't tell White that he was the Demon King. The struggle, concealment, and battle of wits must be quite interesting. However, based on the overall plot framework, the Demon King's consciousness should only be a part of his soul. The Demon King must have another main consciousness. Otherwise, as the protagonist, who would White destroy in the end? Thinking of this, Dake suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He hypothesized a way that White destroyed the Demon King in the original game. If he instigated the Demon King's soul, could he use that soul as the foundation to swallow the Demon King's main soul? In this way, the Demon King wouldn't die again. If he didn't die, of course he couldn't be revived. Dake's thoughts were getting more and more open. He intuitively felt that he had figured out the complete plot of the original game. According to the final plot framework, the things that happened in the school today were most likely because of his arrival. White definitely didn't have the means to deal with the Demon King's consciousness at this time. And unlike the original game, the Demon King's consciousness in his mind should be complete, just a little retarded. If the Demon King's consciousness didn't become retarded after the Christmas incident last year, he might be dead now. As for the means that White used to resist the Demon King's consciousness in the original game, Dake already had an idea. It's the god of Underworld. The moment he figured this out, Dake suddenly had a feeling of enlightenment in his heart. Then he felt the pleasure of sorting out the truth from the messy clues. He really wanted to reach out to the mirror and say, "There's only one truth, you're the murderer." Of course, the above inference was only a bold guess at the moment, and it still needed to be carefully verified. But this time it would be a bit difficult to trick White's second consciousness out. But if the above inference was correct, White was about to encounter the biggest trouble in history. Even if the Demon King's consciousness lost its memory and became retarded, to some extent, it was still the Demon King. If this fact was exposed, how could the Shung Malian Academy protect him? Or would he choose to protect him? That wasn't right. The Academy could also choose to extract the second consciousness out of his body. But White's situation was definitely different from Angus Jeffrey's. If the Academy wanted to extract the second consciousness out of his body, they would probably have to do an experiment of soul cutting. The second consciousness wasn't just a consciousness, it was a second soul. Based on the degree of integration of the two, the experiment of soul cutting was very likely to cause some irreparable damage to him. "Show me your card bag," Professor Shierfu said to White. 3 hours of sleep, went up the mountain to deliver a lamp, and connected a tail. Today is really meaningful. Well, please vote. Chapter 731. Magic cards were the lifeblood of a sorcerer, and would not be easily shown to others. However, White had no right to refuse under such circumstances. He took a deep breath, took off the card bag, and handed it to Professor Sylph. Professor Shierfu felt the weight in his hand, and realized that there were more than 40 magic cards in his card pack. White took tonight's duel very seriously, and even saw it as a milestone in his life. Of course, winning was a milestone, and losing was just a threshold. His second consciousness was influenced by him and made some small moves. When he adjusted the card pack, he added some magic cards that White did not know about. Naturally, there were not only magic cards like Demon General Habakkuk, Vampire Viscount, Blood Devil Sandra, and Blacktail's Blood. If White could adjust his mentality in time, and continue the duel with Dake after his second consciousness had shut himself off, he would have had a chance. Professor Shierfu immediately opened White's card pack, and took out all the magic cards at once. Sister Kulyan, who was beside him, immediately moved the tea set away from the tea table. She put all the magic cards on the table, and looked through them one by one. The first website was https://m. Vipkanshu. VIP. Since there was no cover, everyone's eyes were focused on her. Dake was also very curious about what other magic cards White had. He stopped thinking and looked carefully. Vampire, vampire, vampire. After a while, everyone had a general understanding of the magic cards in the card pack. Unlike Angus Jeffrey's mixed army, most of the cards in White Gowda's card pack were related to vampire. Of course, there were other magic cards related to the Devil Clan, but that was not the main point. Professor Shierfu took his card pack, and wanted to check if there were any magic cards like Demon King, a muster. However, after looking through all the magic cards, she did not find the Demon King. In this card pack, the magic card with the highest star level was a 9-star Vampire Marquis, Vampire Constantine. A 9-star magic fairy was not a big deal in the eyes of everyone present. However, if they followed Dake's deduction, they would find that this was actually a very scary thing. If the second consciousness was the resurrected Demon King, then it would have been resurrected in White Gowda's body last Christmas. Until now, it was still unknown how retarded it was, but its memory was definitely incomplete. Perhaps White's memory was still the dominant one. However, it seemed that the learning ability of the second consciousness was terrifying. From last year's Christmas to this year, in less than a year's time, the second consciousness had already refined a 9-star magic card through learning. Just this ability and talent alone made him worthy of being the most difficult Demon King to deal with in history. Fortunately, it was discovered in time. If it was given more time to learn, it would definitely become a huge threat. With the rapid development of magic technology, more and more sorcerers could no longer control their footsteps. Disaster had already sprouted. Even if there was no revival of the gods, unrestricted magic technology would bring about decline. After Professor Shierfu finished looking at all the magic cards, he put them away and turned to ask, "Are there any more?" White shook his head and said, "Maybe there are, but I don't know. When the time comes, go to your room and check." Professor Shierfu said seriously, "Come here and divide these magic cards into 2 portions. One for you, and the other for it." White moved over and quickly picked through the cards on the table. After he divided the magic cards on the table into 2 piles, Professor Shierfu put the pile of magic cards that he had refined into the card pack, and handed it to him. "Take this. As for this one, I'll keep it for now." Of course, White would not have any objections. He quickly took the half-empty card pack, and tied it to the side of his leg. Under Professor Shierfu's instructions, he sat back in his chair. Professor Shi-Erfu stacked the remaining magic cards into a pile. When he was sorting them out, he took out a magic card called the Glitter Bug and sighed slightly. The appearance of the Glitter Bug more or less confirmed Dake's guess. He was almost certain that White Gouda was the third one. She put the neatly stacked magic cards on the table and let go. Then back to the main topic. Can you find a way to summon the other one in your body? White Gouda said awkwardly. I don't know, Professor. Professor Shi-Erfu crossed his fingers and said softly, try it. You didn't know of its existence before, so you didn't try. But from the current signs, it is very clear about your situation. Obviously, there should be a path between you and it. This path can't be one way. White Gouda was silent for a moment and said, then I'll try. Professor Shi-Erfu nodded slightly and didn't say anything else. White took a deep breath again, then closed his eyes and began to summon the second consciousness in his heart. At this time, he didn't know the possible identity of the second consciousness. Professor Shi-Erfu didn't mention the word Demon King during the whole night of questioning and maintained a relatively peaceful attitude. If the second consciousness could use White Gouda's senses as a window to observe the outside world, then it should only be able to feel the right vigilance. That was a normal precaution against the unknown, and not some radical act of extermination. In a situation where the existence of the second consciousness was completely exposed, there was room for communication between the two sides. Of course, all of this was based on the premise that the second consciousness had lost the memory of being the Demon King. Now that he thought about it, that was very likely. And its brain was more or less a little abnormal, so anything was possible. Professor Shi-Erfu and Dake quietly looked at each other. On the other hand, Dark nodded imperceptibly. The current situation was actually better than expected. The most important point was the existence of Ophelia Bullard. Ophelia Bullard was White Gouda's mother. Her existence was extremely confusing and would make the second consciousness instinctively have the impression that they wouldn't do anything to it. This impression was very important. It was the basis of luring it out. And once it was lured out so easily, then what happened next would be out of its control. It didn't know that Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Heart, wasn't a lie detector, but a monster that could see through people's hearts. Sometimes, it would selectively reveal some secrets and make people lose their vigilance. Fantasy Beast, Goddess of the Heart's little trick was also a trap. Time slowly passed. Professor Mitya and Sister Kalyan began to whisper to each other. Eve's expression was serious as she wrote and drew in the notebook she brought with her. Ophelia Bullard began to drink tea frequently. Everyone was waiting. And White Gouda himself, after trying to call out, immediately came into contact with the second consciousness. This was a development that White himself didn't expect at all. Just as he was about to open his eyes, the second consciousness hurriedly stopped him. The corners of his eyes twitched violently. Then he began to communicate with the second consciousness in his heart. I was born because of you. You and I are one. The second consciousness opened its mouth and said. Of course, White Gouda wouldn't be fooled by these two simple sentences. He immediately asked, who are you? The second consciousness turned and said, do you know about multiple personality disorder? I'm the second personality that was born after you experienced too many setbacks. I represent your will to pursue strength, and the embodiment of your personality that wants to defeat everything. Its voice was gentle. It wasn't as cold and sharp as it had been on the duel field. White Gouda's brows furrowed slightly. This time he was a little moved. Really, after a short silence, the second consciousness said, as I said, you are me, and I am you. I know everything that you know. White Gouda immediately pursued, but I don't know the things that you know. The second consciousness explained. That's because I am the observer, and you are the executor. Once you and I switch places and I take control of the body, you can see what I do from the observer's point of view, just like in that duel. White Gouda carefully recalled, and found that he really did remember the scene of the duel between the second consciousness and Dake. He couldn't help but be surprised. Then why didn't I know when you secretly refined the magic card? The second consciousness said without hesitation. That's because you were sleeping. White. Logic closed loop. But in reality, White had already been guided and interfered with by the second consciousness during this exchange of consciousnesses. He focused all his attention on this actually crude logic closed loop, and subconsciously ignored the loophole that should have been obvious at a glance. When the second consciousness added the magic card to his deck, he wasn't asleep. But there was a hierarchy between the two consciousnesses from the beginning. White didn't have any ability on the spiritual level, but the second consciousness had mastered several, or even dozens of special abilities. The second consciousness wanted to trick him. It was as simple as using a lollipop to trick a 2-year-old to look at a goldfish. It didn't take long for White to believe that the second consciousness was his second personality. He then asked a very important question. Since you and I are of the same origin, why do you know how to refine those magic creatures when I don't know at all? The second consciousness already had an answer. Because of Into the Abyss. Into the Abyss? White was shocked and immediately thought of the book he got from the library when he was in first grade. Although he didn't know where the book called Into the Abyss was now hidden, the taboo love that came from it was still in his card pack, constantly helping him to win. What about that book? He couldn't help but ask. But the second consciousness said, it's not that book, it's another one. I sneaked into the library late at night and picked up another, Into the Abyss. White. The second consciousness said. In that Into the Abyss book, there was a detailed description of part of the cultivation method of the magic creatures. I relied on the method described in it to cultivate a large number of magic creatures' organs, and then used it as a foundation to refine them. After countless attempts, I finally refined those magic cards you saw. White. Those magic cards, are the magic creatures' organs so easy to cultivate? No. The second consciousness shook its head. They are not easy to cultivate. Even if there is a method, it requires a lot of resources to support it, and that's not enough. I used Cameron Macefield for an experiment, and finally came to a conclusion. That book was missing a key piece of information. It wasn't until Angus Jeffrey appeared that I suddenly figured it out. Well, actually, I was lucky. When I was doing the experiment with him, I accidentally dripped 2 drops of blood that I brought with me. That experiment was very successful. Blood? White Gouda said in surprise. The second consciousness asked in a matter-of-fact tone. Don't you know? You have the blood of the Demon King. This plain sentence was like a bolt from the blue, suddenly splitting White's brain open. He couldn't maintain his facial expression, and he clenched his teeth hard. Since the beginning of his first grade, he had been using his own blood as a catalyst for refining magic cards, and had achieved a lot of success. However, that was because he was the hero's son. He felt that the blood of the hero's son flowed in his veins. That was why he could increase the success rate of the magic card crafting, and improve the quality of the magic card. And he could enjoy the benefits with peace of mind. But today, when the second consciousness suddenly pointed it out, he suddenly realized that he had been using the blood of the Demon King to refine magic fairies. White Gouda certainly wasn't the kind of person to believe what others said, especially when it came to this kind of thing. But in fact, the second consciousness's words were not untraceable. He knew that his mother had been embraced by the Demon King before, and was a blood relative of the Demon King, but he didn't think much about it. Now that it was suddenly pointed out, it made him feel like a dusty truth was suddenly revealed, and he subconsciously believed it. The fact that the second consciousness was willing to reveal such a dangerous secret made him trust the second consciousness even more. If before he still had doubts about the second consciousness's identity, now he almost completely believed it. Seeing that he didn't respond, the second consciousness continued. The inheritance of the bloodline isn't something we can decide, but we can use it effectively. There are devils and dark-type magic fairies among them, but they have the blood of the Demon King. We're not the Demon King. That's right. We're not the Demon King. White Gouda suddenly woke up, but he said subconsciously, but what you're doing isn't good. Fern Moores and Angus Jeffrey. The second consciousness immediately said, I'm the embodiment of your personality that wants to conquer everything. In order to become stronger, I'll do anything. From a certain moment, White Gouda's facial expression became very rich. While Dake and the others were waiting, They all realized that he had already made contact with the second consciousness. It's good to have contact, but I'm afraid there's no contact. Dake picked up the teacup and took a sip, then suddenly realized that the tea was cold, so he boiled another pot of tea and poured it for the others. The rich aroma of the black tea gradually spread in the office along with the steam. White Gouda finally opened his eyes when he drank half a cup of the new tea. Dake glanced at his eyes and knew that this was not the second consciousness. Then Professor Shi-Erfa said seriously, "Did you succeed?" White Gouda nodded and said, "I can call it out." Professor Shi-Erfu asked, "Do you know what it is?" White Gouda took a deep breath and said, "It's my second personality. I'm sorry that I didn't notice its existence before. I'll take responsibility for my mistakes." Professor Shi-Erfa said, "It's good that you have this awareness. How's its attitude?" White Gouda said, "It's very peaceful and reasonable. If you want to ask, I can temporarily give it control of this body." "Okay," Professor Shi-Erfu responded and said, "Then call it out." "Okay." White Gouda closed his eyes again. This time, only a few seconds later, he opened his eyes again. His dark pupils spread out slightly, and the proportion of white in his eyes became less than normal. This change was actually not obvious, but both Dake and Professor Shi-Erfu had already noticed it. The second consciousness finally appeared again after it closed itself off. Everyone paused for a moment at this moment. Then they stopped what they were doing and looked at White Gouda. Hephaestus Doragon's expression was still filled with curiosity. Ophelia Bullard's eyes had already become sharp. Professor Shi-Erfu and Dake's expressions did not change much. After the second consciousness opened its eyes, it did not do anything out of the ordinary. Instead, it carefully observed everyone present. Professor Shi-Erfu looked at Fantasy Beast, goddess of the mind's eye, and the latter used its index finger and thumb to form an O shape. Professor Shi-Erfa said, "How should I address you?" The second consciousness frowned and said, "Professor Shi-Erfu, I'm white." Professor Shi-Erfa smiled and said, "Yes, I know. You have a second personality." Her stern face suddenly melted like ice, and a bright smile blossomed on her face. This change was so sudden that no one could react at all. This second consciousness did not completely deceive White. At least, when White controlled the body, it could observe the outside world freely as an observer. But whether it was when it was first born, the memories copied from White's brain, or the memories that continued to accumulate after that, it had never seen Sarah Shi-Erfa smile so brightly. So after a very short stupor, a sharp pain suddenly pierced through its mind. It had an extremely ominous premonition. Almost an instant later, the second consciousness reacted. The pupils in its eyes shrank abruptly. It was clear that it wanted to escape. But in the next second, its face showed an inconceivable shock, and then a murderous look overflowed from the corners of its eyes. The pitch-black magic shot out like an electric current, and it suddenly exploded and pounced on the stack of magic cards on the table. Ha! Professor Shi-Erfu just reached out and tapped lightly, and a strong wind suddenly blew in the office. The paper documents on the desk rustled, and White Gouda's bangs were blown up. The wind that turned into a rope suddenly contracted and tied its body tightly. It was in midair, but it could no longer move. At that time, apart from the second consciousness, quite a few people also looked surprised. Dake was also surprised, but when he turned his gaze, he found that Sister Ka Lien had already revealed a smile, and Professor Midia had a card up her sleeve. It was clear that Professor Shi-Erfa's actions weren't sudden, but had been premeditated all along. The only people who knew about her plan should be Sister Ka Lien and Professor Midia. "Hey, can I come in now?" Lily Laplace poked her head out from the ceiling. Dake's eyebrows twitched. Well, they were probably worried that Professor Lily wouldn't be able to keep her cool, so they had assigned her the task of standing guard outside. Looking at the second consciousness, it was tied up in midair by Professor Shi-Erfu and couldn't resist. The only thing it could reach was the White Gouda's card bag. But it hadn't chosen to use the White Gouda's magic cards in the beginning to fight, and it was already too late to make a choice now. Half a minute later, it seemed to have finally realized that it couldn't escape. It gradually calmed down, and its face was filled with confusion. "Why? What, why? Professor Shi-Erfu asked slowly. Why did I catch you? Why can't you escape? Or is it because I don't believe that you're White's second personality? The second consciousness's face was ashen. It braced itself and said, even if you don't believe it, it's the truth. I know that I made mistakes because of my radicalism, but that was just to win. I want to become stronger. I want to become stronger than Dake. I want to defeat him. I want to cross the threshold. I have to do that. Well, I know I'm wrong. I'll change, Professor. Seeing that Professor Shi-Erfu was completely unmoved, it struggled and suddenly turned its head to look at Ophelia Brad, the bloody maiden, and cried sadly, Mom! But from Ophelia Brad's eyes, there was only murderous intent. The pupils of the second consciousness suddenly shrank. It knew that there was no way it could escape. It immediately stopped acting. Its face was cold, but the magic in its body was crazily surging out under its control, trying to break through the shackles of the wind lock. But Professor Shi-Erfu had already picked out a magic card, and quickly recited the words in his mind. 3 seconds later, 3 long transparent needles emerged from the card's surface. Then, under her control, they flew out and nailed itself between its eyebrows, its heart, and its dantian. After that, the 3 long needles were connected by rays of light, forming a triangle. The second consciousness suddenly realized that it could no longer mobilize the magic in its body. Its 4 limbs were bound, and its magic was sealed. It couldn't turn around at all. Bang! White Gouda's body was thrown back onto the chair. The second consciousness desperately opened its eyes. It hadn't completely given up. Even though its 4 limbs were bound and its magic was sealed, it still had a mouth. It could speak, and it could use its words to fight for a chance to survive. But all of this happened too suddenly. It still hadn't fully reacted. It couldn't even understand why Professor Shi-Erfu would treat it like this. Just as Dake had deduced, it didn't actually know what its identity was. It was just a pitiful, brainless little thing. Professor Shi-Erfu, can you tell us now? After a moment of silence, Ophelia Brad was the first to ask. She must be desperate to know everything that she could. But Professor Shi-Erfu shook his head and said, there's no hurry. Let's ask Dake's magic fairy first. But when she looked at Illusionary Beast, Goddess of the Mind's Eye, Dake asked curiously, can you first tell us how you fixed its consciousness? Let me tell you. Sister Kalien smiled and said, after all, I performed a consciousness extraction operation on Angus Jeffrey with Professor Ka-Zayer. I finally gained some experience. Although White Gouda's second consciousness is very similar to Angus Jeffrey's second consciousness, it's actually not completely the same. Body-soul consciousness. Angus Jeffrey's second consciousness is just a second consciousness. It's attached to the same soul as Angus Jeffrey's main consciousness. But White Gouda is different. His soul is also split. What's going on? Ophelia Brad suddenly asked anxiously. Sister Kalien glanced at her and said, it's not exactly split. In his current state, it's possible that the 2 souls are fused together and then cut in half. Let's use an analogy. As she spoke, she picked up 2 pieces of white paper from the table and stacked them together. She said, White Gouda's current state of soul is like these 2 pieces of paper. When they are stacked together, they turn from 2 to 1, and then with a little force, she slowly tore the 2 pieces of white paper apart from the middle, leaving only a little connection. Just like this, she said. His soul is divided into 2 parts like this. Then there are 2 consciousnesses attached to one part of the 2. This explanation was simple and easy to understand. Even Dake immediately understood. But it would have been better if she didn't say it. Now that she said it, Ophelia Brad completely understood. She couldn't help but murmur. If they are so deeply integrated, how can they be separated? There will always be a way. Sister Kalien looked indifferent. But if one looked closely, they would find that there was excitement hidden in the depths of her eyes. A new white mouse in EI, Sister Kalien continued. After coming to this conclusion, it means that as long as its soul is fixed, it can't escape. Consciousnesses are intangible, but souls are tangible. Unless it can break free from the shackles of the soul and continue to live as pure ideology. But obviously it can't do that. That is the patent of the gods. She said it casually, but even if it was just fixing the soul, it wasn't something that ordinary people could do. Moreover, her method was untraceable. Even the bystanders couldn't see her move. For someone with this kind of ability, what did she do to be kicked out by the Holy Church? Dake thought in a daze. After that, he didn't ask any more questions. If he asked too much, he was afraid that the second consciousness would find a way to break free. He turned to Magical Beast, goddess of the heart's eye, and said, "Next, tell me everything you saw." Magical Beast, goddess of the heart's eye, calmly told him everything it saw, from beginning to end. From the moment it was summoned, White Gouda's mental activity didn't escape its insight. And from the moment the second consciousness took the initiative to come into contact with White Gouda, the communication between them also didn't escape its insight. In other words, the second consciousness's spiritual conversation with White Gouda, as well as its thoughts at that time, had already been exposed. Phantasmal Beast, goddess of the heart's eye, then told him everything that happened, no matter how big or small. As the second consciousness listened, sweat appeared on its forehead. It looked at Magical Beast, goddess of the heart's eye, with blazing flames in its eyes. After a period of time, everyone present, including Eve, Olga, and Hephaestus, had a more specific understanding of the situation. The conversation between the second consciousness and White Gouda was a mixture of truth and falsehood. It was indeed easy to bait people. However, its inner thoughts at that time had completely exposed itself. It had indeed been born after Christmas last year. The timing was completely consistent with Dake's inference. When it had just been born, it had been blank. Including its memories, there was nothing. What helped it gain knowledge was White's memories. It had copied White's memories and gained the most basic knowledge. It was also influenced by White's thoughts and became what it called a personality that wants to defeat everything. Of course, it didn't have multiple personalities. It was just like Dark Game, a body of consciousness with its own soul. However, its way of thinking was ultimately different from White's. It used the perspective of an observer to absorb all the information that White could come into contact with. However, it gradually developed a completely different understanding from White's. It thought 24 hours a day and easily sensed a lot of information that White didn't. For example, the fact that White had the blood of the Demon King flowing in her body. Not long after it realized this, the second consciousness suddenly found some memories that it didn't have before in its mind. Those were memories of part of the demon race's cultivation method. In the beginning, there were only a few memories, so they did not attract its attention. However, as time passed and the memories gradually increased, it realized that something was happening. Later, it understood. It really did understand. Not only did it understand where those memories came from, but it also understood why it was born. Those memories were brought by the blood of the Demon King. It was born to become the Demon King and revive the demon race. To be honest, it couldn't be blamed. After all, the information that the second consciousness could obtain was extremely limited. Ophelia Bullard didn't tell White about the Demon King's vessel, so the second consciousness naturally didn't know. It didn't think that the Demon King could be resurrected in White's body after death. It also didn't think that it was the Demon King that it wanted to become. At this time, Dake had more or less confirmed its guess. However, the conclusions derived from this were both good and bad. First of all, the Demon King did resurrect in White Gouda's body after death. Second, the Demon King completely lost its memories after resurrecting. Yes, it was a little retarded. Finally, the Demon King's memory loss wasn't permanent. It could recover. This last conclusion was very troublesome. Although it didn't know if it was related to the blood of the Demon King, the second consciousness did recover part of its memories. With that part of its memories, it used the book Demon's Skin to write the book, Into the Abyss. The reason for this name was naturally because White once had a book called Into the Abyss. It really liked that sentence. Walk into the abyss, stare into the abyss. Then, considering that White didn't have the conditions to experiment, it found Cameron Macefield and tempted him to breed demons. After Cameron Macefield's failed breeding, it made some improvements to Into the Abyss, and then found Angus Jeffrey. At this time, Into the Abyss could already interfere with the mind and cause the holder to have a second consciousness. Their first experiment wasn't carried out in the secret tunnel. Later on, due to some coincidences, they found the correct breeding method and bred the first demon, the brain fluid demon. After that, in order to verify their ideas, they bred the second brain fluid demon, step by step. After the brain fluid demon was bred, considering the need for secrecy in the experiment, the second consciousness guided Angus Jeffrey to breed the organs of the glitter worm, and finally refined it into a card, not using the basic refining method, but a directional refining method. As the research deepened, the second consciousness found that its memories were still increasing, but it was all knowledge about the demon creatures. This knowledge provided it with the basic conditions for directional refining. Of course, the leader of the experiment was still Angus Jeffrey. It didn't use the directional refining ability alone. However, relying on Angus Jeffrey, the second consciousness was able to refine quite a few high-star magic elven cards. As for Angus Jeffrey's Demon King Amu, it was actually very envious. However, it was personally refined by Angus Jeffrey, so it couldn't steal it. The whole process wasn't very complicated. With the fantasy beast, the goddess of the mind's eye, as straightforward description, Dake and the others quickly sorted out their thoughts. In fact, the number of people involved in this incident was very small. Cameron Macefield was one, but he was basically just a bystander. Angus Jeffrey was another, but he wasn't just a victim. Vern Moores was another, and he was the only complete victim. As for White Gouda, now it seemed that he couldn't be considered the perpetrator, but he also couldn't be considered the victim. To say that he was the perpetrator, he didn't do anything. To say that he was the victim, he was the beneficiary. If it weren't for the existence of the second consciousness, he wouldn't have been able to win the Silver Cup championship. But in that case, Saraswati was more of a victim. In short, this was a muddled account that was difficult to sort out. Considering that this matter couldn't be made public, it was impossible to return the Silver Cup championship to Sarah. From the point of view of the professors, they could only give her some credits as compensation. As for White, after knowing that he didn't rely on his own ability to win the Silver Cup championship, he probably even wanted to die. You guys, what are you going to do with me? The second consciousness didn't know that the magical beast, goddess of the heart's eye, had the ability to read minds. It had some confidence in its mental abilities, but it did not expect that it would be completely exposed without even the slightest bit of awareness. But at this point, it had no other choice but to admit defeat. After that, Professor Shi-Erfa's answer didn't leave any room for negotiation. Cut it off. In short, it had to be cut off from the White Gouda first. This was the biggest prerequisite. As for whether to destroy or seal it, they would have to consider it later. But considering that the Demon King could be resurrected after death, the professors would most likely choose to seal it. If there's no good way to cut the soul, I can try. Dake suddenly interjected. Since the essence of the second consciousness was actually the soul, then the coffin of the dead was an expert in this area. However, after being eaten by the coffin of the dead, the Demon King would still be resurrected in other containers, so it could only be considered a last resort. They discussed how to deal with the second consciousness one by one, causing it to feel a chill down its spine. It wished it could just die on the spot. It still didn't know that it was very likely to be the Demon King. Everyone present was very cautious, and no one revealed this information to it. Finally, it couldn't take it anymore and wanted to curse, but the wind threads around its mouth suddenly increased and blocked its mouth in a timely manner. Ooh! It could only desperately make sounds. Professor Shi-Erfu resisted the urge to cut it into 3 pieces and said, "It's almost Christmas and Cynthia should be back. Let her decide then. If there's no other way, just kill it." Ooh. It could only be said that the second consciousness's desire to live was very strong. Dake glanced at it and said, "If you can successfully cut it, you can consider refining it into a magical fairy." Ooh. Its cries became more and more shrill. Fantasy beast, goddess of the heart's eye, suddenly said. It said refining it into a living thing is taboo. Professor Shi-Erfa said, Under normal circumstances, a living thing will die in the process of being refined into a magical fairy. Dake smiled and was about to say something when Fantasy Beast, goddess of the heart's eye, suddenly said, "It said that it has a very important piece of information, and it wants to exchange it for its life." Dake was stunned, and then he slowly looked at Fantasy Beast, goddess of the heart's eye. Fantasy Beast, goddess of the heart's eye, directly said, "It said that it can feel that far away. There's a comrade who bears the same fate, and it can help us find it." The second consciousness. Woo woo. Ooh. When I woke up, I dropped another place on the monthly votes list. She cried as soon as she wailed. Chapter 732. A comrade who bears the same fate? Dake and Professor Earbook quickly exchanged glances, their expressions unchanged. At this time, they were basically certain that this second consciousness was the reincarnation of the Demon King. They did not think that this second consciousness had any comrade who bears the same fate. But what if it really did? With a gentle wave of her finger, Professor Sylph unraveled the wind seal on the second consciousness. As soon as the second consciousness could speak, it immediately begged, "Trust me." It really bent at the first turn. Dake sighed. He did not expect the Demon King to have such a personality. However, from its experience of being beaten by the pink furry rabbit until it became autistic, he could more or less see that the Demon King, at this time, was not an unusually tenacious character. However, he did not expect the Demon King to take the initiative to betray its comrade in order to survive. Who is the comrade it is talking about? Dake could not help but think, is it the remnants of the demons who have the same ambition and wish to revive the demons? Or is it a hidden demon general? Or is it the surviving son of the Demon King? It can still feel the presence of that comrade in the academy, so it should have a close relationship, right? Maybe it's a critical container. Remember the URL. MVIP, can't you? 6. While he was thinking about this, Professor Earbook asked directly, 3 questions. Think about it before you answer them. Who is it? Where is it? How did you sense it? What is the connection between the two of you? As soon as these 3 questions were asked, the second consciousness immediately knew that it had a chance of survival. It quickly said, "I will tell you everything I know, but you have to promise to spare my life." This request was a bit too much. Professor Earbook suddenly felt a little troubled, but she quickly changed her mind and said, "How about half of your life?" The second consciousness. Okay. Professor Earbook could not help but let out a small cry of surprise. She was just joking, but she didn't expect her second consciousness to agree so quickly. As if it was afraid that Professor Earbook would change his mind, it immediately told him everything it knew. It was during the holidays. When I was observing the white experiment, I suddenly felt a warmth rising in the distance. It made me feel that I was not alone. Aren't you White's second personality? Dake interrupted. The second consciousness turned around and said in slight embarrassment, "That's different." In fact, at that time, the second consciousness wasn't sure what it was. In the beginning, he did think that he was a split personality of the White Gouda. However, later on, he discovered that he had a complete personality, and the White Gouda was not missing anything. Thus, the hypothesis of a split personality was not valid. As he gradually recovered his memory of the demon breeding method, he felt that he might be the Demon King's backup plan, a special descendant born from the Demon King's blood. Although it was very strange that a descendant of the Demon King was born from the hero's body, the stranger it was, the easier it was to accept. After all, it was special. From this perspective, the second consciousness was indeed a split of White's memories. Both of them had the same subconscious, and they had a very clear understanding of their own uniqueness. Ever since White knew that he was the hero's son, he had always felt that he was special, and thus had extraordinary requirements for himself. He thought of using his own blood to refine a magic fairy for the same reason. It was the same for the second consciousness. Because of its uniqueness, it had high expectations for itself and had always pursued its so-called mission. Because of this, it was exposed originally. It had been hiding and secretly shooting guns. After 8 to 10 years, it would have become an archmage of the 10-mile slope or something. Who knew how far it could go? However, it was unwilling to be left alone and jumped out. Wasn't it caught? Sigh, this sounded like something White would do, as expected of a product born from White's memories. The second consciousness continued. Anyway, that warmth gradually became clearer after that. I could feel that it was very similar to me. It was like we were twins, advancing and retreating together. We must have the same mission in life. As for who it was, I don't know. Every time the sun rose, my perception of it would be very strong, but when the sun set, that feeling would quickly die down. As for where it was, I don't know. I only know that it was in the west, very far away from me. Then it saw Professor Shi-Erfu immediately turned to look at Fantasy Beast, goddess of the mind's eye, after hearing this, and said urgently, I know she can see through my thoughts. I'm not lying. There's no way she would do anything under your nose. Fantasy Beast, goddess of the mind's eye, said slowly. She thought that even if she told you about that comrade's existence, you wouldn't be able to find her. That's why she wanted to exchange for her life. The second consciousness. Ah. Facing an existence that could read one's thoughts, no one would be able to remain calm. However, although the second consciousness's thoughts were stupid, there was a logic to them. This made it more or less lose some of its moral integrity. Although it wouldn't improve everyone's impression of it, they wouldn't think that it was a complete piece of trash. Of course, this wasn't a good thing. Dake pondered for a moment and said, Is there anything else you want to say? The second consciousness turned around and said, I've already told you everything I know. You promised me. Dake shook his head. Hey, I didn't promise you anything. The second consciousness immediately turned to Professor Shi-Erfu and said anxiously, But it promised me. Professor Shi-Erfu gave it a kind smile. Dake said, Your information is so vague that it's difficult for us to do anything. Do you remember when you sensed your comrade's time? Which day was it during the holidays? Don't say that you forgot. No one will believe you. The second consciousness. 15th of July. 15th of July? Dake immediately became alert and looked at Professor Shi-Erfu. Professor Shi-Erfu looked at him almost at the same time. The two of them looked at each other and were slightly shocked. Dake immediately asked, Then when you first sensed her, where was she? The second consciousness. South. The second consciousness had a special ability on the mental level. It could control its own thoughts and prevent itself from thinking about things that it shouldn't think about. However, if Dake asked, it would have to answer. When it said this, Fantasy Beast, goddess of the mind's eye, could tell whether it was true or not. It first sensed her comrade's aura on the 15th of July. At that time, her comrade was in the south. The Shungmalian Academy was now located in the north of the kingdom. The south was the direction of the royal capital. On the 15th of July, the Holy Church held the Demon King execution ceremony in St. Louis Square in the royal capital. At that time, although Dake wasn't present, he saw everything through the telepathy spell between Evelyn and Evelyn from a distance. He had a very deep impression of the Demon King execution ceremony. Professor Shi-Erfu directly attacked the Demon King execution ceremony at the scene. There were a few people present who had seen it as well. A lot of things happened during the Demon King execution ceremony. Excluding the minor details, the Holy Church had used the ritual of witch hunt and great prophecy during the Demon King execution ritual to refine the Demon King's corpse in reverse, causing a new soul to be born in the empty shell of the corpse. However, no one knew what the condition of the soul was. After the new soul was born, the Holy Church used the lock of light to bind it, burned it with the holy fire, and clamped it with the rules of the ritual. In the end, they summoned the door to the underworld, the door frame. Using the door frame of the door to the underworld as bait, the Holy Church put on a big show and killed many remnants of the demon race. At that time, the witch's hunt ritual was still going smoothly. The new Demon King's soul was still being burned by the fire. The Holy Church gave people the feeling that they were going to send the Demon King's soul into the underworld. However, in reality, the Demon King's soul was created on the spot. The door to the underworld wasn't really opened. Dake, Shi-Erfu, and the others saw through these arrangements at that time. However, they still didn't know what the Holy Church was planning. They wanted to wait and see what would happen. However, after that, an accident happened. A small butterfly flew to the door to the underworld and used her antennae to poke a very small hole in the door to the underworld. Then the underworld and the real world were truly connected at that moment. The new Demon King's soul was really sucked into the underworld in an instant. Countless fire of the underworld drilled out at that moment. Some of them attached themselves to many people who were present at that time, while some drifted far away and drilled into more people's bodies. Even though the chief archbishop, Caleb Norris, repaired the hole at the fastest speed, everything was out of control. It was too late. No matter what the Holy Church's original plan was, it was impossible to implement it. However, if the second consciousness felt the comrade's aura that day, because there was only one of them, it wasn't likely to be the remnants of the demon race who were present at that time. In fact, Dake and the others were more or less sure that the second consciousness was the Demon King reincarnated after Easter's death. Then the so-called comrade could only be the new Demon King's remnant soul. The Holy Church has a strong foundation. Dake couldn't help but think so in his heart after he sorted out his thoughts. Although he saw through many things at that time, he always felt that the new soul, refined by the Holy Church, was just a fake with a huge flaw. It might not be too different from the Demon King's soul, but it probably didn't have the ability to reincarnate. It didn't have the Demon King's unsolvable immortality. However, at this moment, the words of the second consciousness seemed to be telling him that the new Demon King's soul also had the ability to reincarnate. Moreover, even the death of being sucked away by the door to the underworld didn't make it truly die. When the new Demon King's soul was sucked away by the door to the underworld, the connection between reality and the underworld was personally made by the Archbishop. To the present world it was dead. Then naturally it was resurrected. In other words, the new Demon King's soul was resurrected, and it was resurrected in the West. This was a very simple logical deduction. However, superficial deduction was different from in-depth investigation. This was because the truth was indeed a little shocking. From the south to the west, how did it go over? Dake asked. The second consciousness frowned slightly and said, It jumped over, right? Maybe it was teleportation, or something else. In short, it was just a moment. At first, I almost thought that it was two people, but it must have some kind of method. Dake asked again. How long was it from the south to the west? The second consciousness slowly said, A little bit of time? A few seconds, a few dozen seconds. I didn't pay much attention to it, so my memory is a little fuzzy. Dake. During that period of time, did it completely disappear? The second consciousness said, Maybe it was during the teleportation process, so I couldn't form a sense of it. This isn't something that requires too much attention. After saying this, it suddenly realized something and asked subconsciously, Do you know who it is? Dake raised his head and smiled. Even if I knew, I wouldn't tell you. A Devil King who didn't know he was a Devil King was naturally easier to deal with than a Devil King who knew he was a Devil King. Dake and the professors had already reached a tacit agreement to hide this truth from him. The second consciousness saw that he didn't intend to answer, so it could only bury its fear in its heart. It said, From the looks of it, my comrade should have a very high status, so my information is very valuable. You can't go back on your words. Moreover, although I can only sense his general direction, if I get closer, I might be able to sense his precise location. If you want to find him, you must need me. Being able to turn into a radar was its greatest reliance. In its heart, it actually had another idea, but it deliberately suppressed its thoughts and didn't let itself think in that direction. It didn't completely trust these humans in front of it. Even if they were the type who kept their promises in the White Gouda's memory, it couldn't bet its life on their kindness. Being able to sense the comrade's direction was the follow-up value it could derive from deliberately revealing this information. It needed this value to ensure its survival. After that, as long as it could successfully find that comrade, it still had a chance to live. It had placed its last hope on that comrade. Although the second consciousness didn't reveal this idea, with Dake and the others' intelligence, they would naturally figure it out when the time came. This wasn't actually a secret idea. It could even be said to be an open conspiracy. Moreover, its idea was destined to succeed. It didn't know this. Once Dake and Professor Shi-Erfu could confirm that its so-called information was about a new Devil King, they would probably be more anxious to find that comrade than the second consciousness. Reality had changed too quickly. In less than a year, the second consciousness had transformed from a blank slate into a powerful archmage who could create a 9-star magic guide fairy. This was a warning to Professor Shi-Erfu and the others. Finding that comrade as soon as possible was something they had to do after Headmaster Erdi returned. The reason why they didn't do it immediately wasn't because Christmas was around the corner. Of course, school affairs weren't as important as finding the new Devil King as soon as possible. However, there was something more important during Christmas. Everything had an order, and that was all. In front of God, the Devil King who hadn't reached God's realm could only be pushed back. In the end, Professor Shi-Erfu asked the second consciousness, "Is there anything else you want to say?" The second consciousness was silent for a long time, but it still shook its head. Professor Shi-Erfu took out a magic guide card and silently recited an incantation. Just as the first consciousness was feeling nervous, a wave of drowsiness suddenly surged over it. It quickly disintegrated its resistance, causing it to fall into a deep sleep. Professor Shi-Erfu waved his hand again, and the wind threads binding it suddenly increased. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a huge cocoon, completely sealing it from head to toe. Next, it's time for the meeting. Professor Shi-Erfu waved his hand and said to everyone. The interrogation of White Gouda ended temporarily. Professor Lily flapped his wings and flew to Dake's side. He squeezed in between Eve and Dake, and then he happily swung his little legs. Dake moved to the edge of the sofa and leaned over to pour tea for her. After Professor Shi-Erfu announced the start of the meeting, Ophelia Bradley was the first to speak. "Professor Shi-Erfu, are we really going to keep it alive?" Professor Shi-Erfu didn't expect her to ask this question first. He was a little surprised. "I thought you would ask about White's situation first." However, Ophelia Bradley just shook her head and said, "There's nothing to ask. It's very clear what White did and didn't do. He and the demon. Well, the Demon King's soul is now partially merged. However, there's Professor Stephen Harvey in the academy. I believe in his ability." Professor Stephen Harvey was the 6th grade professor of Introduction to Magic half a year ago. Now he didn't teach the main course. Instead, he chose to take an elective course called Medicine, and was in a state of half-rest. His other identity was one of the few remaining necromancers. After Ophelia Bradley was refined into a magic card by Dake, Professor Stephen Harvey personally separated her soul from the vampire's daughter, magic card, and glued it back to her body. It could be said that Professor Stephen Harvey was another one of Ophelia Bullard's saviors. Dake's beginner, soul loss spell, was also improved by Professor Stephen Harvey. It was normal for Ophelia Bradley to have this kind of trust in Professor Stephen Harvey. However, Professor Shi-Erfu shook his head and said, "This time, I'm afraid even Professor Stephen Harvey will find it difficult to handle. However, we'll definitely do our best." Wait. At this time, Hephaestus Doragon, who had been watching the show, finally asked his doubts. "You're saying that thing is the Demon King?" It was quite obvious that Olga and Eve's eyes were focused on Professor Shi-Erfu's face. They were waiting for his answer. Professor Shi-Erfu sighed and said something meaningful. "It's not the Demon King. The one in the west is the Demon King." Professor Shi-Erfu quickly realized that before this meeting, it was obvious that he should tell the few participants the cause of the incident. Therefore, he didn't want to waste time talking about it, so he gave this difficult task to Dake Dimung. The lowly little Dake had no right to refuse at this time. He could only waste his time talking about what happened last Easter. The story was actually very complicated and strange, and it was mixed with many things that ordinary people couldn't understand. Olga and Eve knew a little about it, but it was the first time Hephaestus heard about it. It was also the first time she knew that the secret tunnel in Shengmalian Academy was so special. Later on, when they heard that Ophelia was refined into a magical fairy by Dake, they couldn't help but look at Ophelia with a strange expression. Cough. Even someone like Fresh Blood Concubine, who was as soft as tofu, couldn't help but cough hard. When Hephaestus heard that Professor Stephen Harvey glued her soul back to her corpse, she suddenly said, "So, our class Victoria is your... Hey, is she your sister or your daughter?" Ophelia said awkwardly, "Victoria. Is that the vampire girl's name?" She knew about Victoria's existence and even secretly looked at her. However, because she was still under house arrest, she didn't have any actual contact with Victoria. Hephaestus sighed again. "Why? She's from the same origin as you, so why didn't she inherit any of your good points?" Cough cough, let's not digress. Dake decisively interrupted her and continued to talk about the Demon King's current situation. Not long after, Hephaestus, Olga, and Eve finally understood the whole situation, and then the three of them fell silent. Although Dark had downplayed the entire incident, it was as if the sky had collapsed if one were to examine it carefully. If it was someone else, they would probably yell at them, "Hey, that's the Demon King, the Demon King." But in short, this incident didn't just involve the Demon King. It also involved the heroes, the Saint, and the school. To the Saint, whether it was Bloodbell Ophelia Blood or the new Demon King in the West, they were all top secrets that couldn't be told to outsiders. To the school, although the professors didn't mean to, they still personally caused the death and revival of the Demon King's body. This was also a top secret that couldn't be revealed. Even Dark was closely involved in this matter. Although he played a good role in it, it would be hard to explain if he really pointed it out. The Saint would definitely include him in their calculations to shift the blame. Because whether it was Bloodbell Ophelia Blood or the other small characters involved, they weren't enough to go against the Saint. In the end, they couldn't take the blame. Only by involving the Shungmalian Academy and the Valkyrie faction could the world know that this wasn't the Saint's fault. Our Saint sect has no choice. But speaking of which, if it was only the Easter incident, the Saint had to bear the responsibility of not being able to defend the prison. First, it was unfavorable to the defense of Badia prison, causing Bloodbell, who had been embraced by the Demon King, to escape from the prison. They couldn't catch her in time. Second, it was unfavorable to the defense of the Demon King, and they couldn't stop Bloodbell from killing him. But after that, the Saint held the Demon King execution ceremony. That was just to roast oneself on a fire. It was lucky that one wasn't burned to death. So in the end, the best way was to keep it a secret. As long as the Saint and the school reached a tacit agreement, this secret could still be kept. Once the secret was leaked, the consequences would be unpredictable. But what if the secret was really leaked? Then on the school's side, they had to deny the Easter incident, deny that the second consciousness of the White Gouda was the Demon King, and let everyone know that the Demon King in the West was the real one. It was the Saint who didn't do well in the Demon King execution ceremony, and let the Demon King escape. Choosing the lesser of two evils was also applicable to the Saint sect. In the current environment, what the people couldn't stand the most was not the Demon King escaping, but being deceived. Once it was exposed that the Demon King execution ceremony was deceptive, the Saint would really start to collapse. As for the Demon King that escaped, he would be caught sooner or later. Even if some people blamed the Saint for letting the Demon King escape, as long as they kept the secret and caught the Demon King as soon as possible, it wasn't impossible for the Saint to clear their name. Even after they caught the Demon King, most of the people would forget the mistakes they made in the past. So, can I ask that question now? Ophelia asked the question that she had been holding back for a long time. Professor Shi-Erfu, do you really want to leave the Demon King half alive? Professor Shi-Erfu turned his head and said calmly, "What do you think about how to deal with it?" Ophelia immediately said fiercely, "I want to drink its blood and eat its flesh." Hephaestus whispered in her ear, "The only things you can drink and eat now are your son's blood and flesh." Ophelia was speechless. She was obviously very well-mannered, which was why Hephaestus was spared. Uffed. Little Lily with pointy ears puffed up his cheeks like a bun, but he still deflated in the end. Dake also wanted to laugh, but he was obviously very well-mannered, so he successfully held it in. Professor Shi-Erfu didn't change the topic because of this. He said with a straight face, "Blood can be drunk, meat can be eaten, but people can't be killed." Since they already knew that the Demon King's memories could be recovered, they couldn't let it escape no matter what. It took so much effort to walk into the trap. How can we let it escape? Dake shook his head. Then, Ophelia looked at Dake and said, refine it into a magic guide fairy. Dake repeated what Professor She-Urfa said. Under normal circumstances, a living creature will die in the process of being refined into a magic guide fairy. Ophelia immediately frowned and said with a bitter expression, you can do it, right? The refinement of a magic guide was a very meticulous process. Even if the steps of the basic experiment seemed simple, the internal reaction was extremely complicated. The so-called simplicity was built on the complexity of the refinement formation itself. Thus, during the refinement process, no matter what creature's soul or consciousness was, it would be erased by the extremely complicated reaction process. It would be fine if it didn't succeed, but if it did, it meant that the creature had died. But on the night of Easter, there was a person who broke common sense and made the impossible possible. Dake added bliss into the refinement that night, and successfully protected Ophelia Blood's soul and consciousness. However, when faced with Ophelia's almost pleading gaze, Dake still said rationally, Auntie, it's not that I don't want to help, it's that I can't. Using the souls of living creatures as materials to refine a magic guide is not a field that I can dabble in. The success last time was built on the foundation of the entire ritual. I only provided a little help and changed the direction of the ritual. After a while he said, maybe I'll be able to do it after I master the method of refining the ritual. Ophelia immediately said respectfully, that should be fast, right? You're so smart. White is always praising you in front of me. Ha! Dake still smiled. Auntie, you're so clumsy when you flatter me. Ophelia's face immediately turned red. You child. All right. Professor She-Urfa reminded. As for the final treatment of the Demon King's soul, we still have to wait for Cynthia to come back before we make a decision. My subjective opinion is to seal it, but Ophelia's example shows me that just sealing it isn't safe. Refining it into a magic guide fairy card is indeed a very good idea, but the risk is very high. However, the risk of successfully refining magic was very high. No one could guarantee a 100% success rate in their experiments, even if it was a ritual. Therefore, we need to carefully consider whether or not to take this risk. As for what Dake said, that he hasn't mastered the ritual, that's not hard to solve. We can ask Kazair to give him special treatment, and we can also help him set up the ritual when he wants to refine the card. In short, none of this is a problem. As long as the Demon King's soul can be successfully separated from White's soul. Hearing her say this, Ophelia suddenly became anxious again, but she didn't have any other options at the moment. We're all on the same side, so let's not talk about pretentious things. Professor She-Urfa changed the topic. Let's talk about confidentiality now. You might not know about it in the academy. Because of Angus Jeffrey, the incident that happened in the academy has been noticed. Fortunately, White didn't reveal too much in the duel tonight, so luck is still on our side. In short, what happened tonight can't be revealed, and we have to come up with a way to hide it. That's easy. Dake raised his hand and said, we just have to push all the blame for Angus Jeffrey and White's misfortune to Underworld Fire. Underworld Fire? Everyone looked at each other, and they all agreed with Dake's quick thinking. Professor She-Urfa couldn't help but sigh. Underworld Fire, it is. Come to think of it, there's no more suitable excuse than this. In the past 6 months, the Holy Church has been in a terrible fix because of the things that leaked out from the door to the underworld, so they'll be very sensitive about it. However, the various signs that Angus Jeffrey and White Gouda showed are quite similar to when they were possessed by Underworld Fire. Dake crossed his fingers and said slowly, although not many people know, Angus Jeffrey was possessed by Underworld Fire a long time ago. They can't come into contact with White, but they can check on Angus Jeffrey. There had always been obvious signs that Angus Jeffrey had been possessed by the fire of the underworld. Unless they can find out the exact time of those signs, they'll only be led into a trap. Of course, if their understanding of Underworld Fire is really that detailed, not only will this excuse not work, but it will also be exposed. It won't be exposed. Professor Shi-Erfu's lips curled up and he smiled. If it's the Holy Church, they'll understand. The Holy Church wouldn't want anything related to the Demon King's resurrection to be exposed. It was fine if they didn't investigate clearly, but once they did, the excuse of underworld fire would be a warning to them. They weren't fools. In this matter, the Holy Church would even help to hide it. Professor Shi-Erfu said, "We'll know the general situation by looking at Earl Jeffrey's reaction in the next few days." After that, they continued to discuss this topic for a while. They deliberated more about the details of the excuse, and finally reached a consensus. As for the treatment of the White Gouda, they would put it aside for the time being. Professor Shi-Erfu and Sister Ka-Lien would send him to Professor Stephen Harvey's dormitory. Without Professor Ka-Zaire, they could only rely on Sister Ka-Lien to cooperate with Professor Stephen Harvey. In short, they would first look at Professor Harvey's diagnosis before talking about anything else. But as they talked, they inexplicably reached a consensus and decided to go to Professor Stephen Harvey's dormitory together. "We're all just here to watch," Dake sighed in his heart. No one wanted to be left out. Everyone wanted to know the development of the situation as soon as possible. In the end, they couldn't bear to leave. Of course, there were also people like Ophelia Bullard who really cared about White's condition. But in short, they hid their tracks and soon arrived in front of Professor Stephen Harvey's dormitory. It was close to midnight, and the night was extremely dark. But for Professor Stephen Harvey, this was just the beginning of a day. When he opened the door, his face was full of energy. People who saw Professor Stephen Harvey for the first time would usually be surprised. No one would think that this short little old man in pink pajamas and nightcap was the legendary necromancer who played with corpses and souls. But Dake was already very familiar with him. Professor Stephen Harvey was always kind and somewhat cute. Except for his cold jokes, he was very easy to get along with. "Dimming, what's the matter?" "Well, there's a little guy over here who looks like he's in trouble." "Oh, isn't this Little Bat? Why are you here again?" "This little guy over here. Oh, it's Little Bat." "Professor Harvey, I'm no longer a vampire." Ophelia Bullard's expression turned a little awkward, and she hurriedly said, "I know. You're a fresh blood. There's not much difference." Professor Harvey waved his hand. His eyes were completely attracted by the White Gouda. Although the White Gouda was still wrapped in the cocoon of wind, it was nothing to Professor Harvey. "Choose 3 people to come in. You used the invisible needle to pin his soul. Is there a problem with that? Does the soul have legs and want to escape?" He turned around and said, "No, it doesn't have legs, but it has an extra head." Dake walked into the room. Then Professor Shi-Erfu also stepped over the threshold. But after thinking for a while, she handed the White Gouda to Sister Ka-Lien and stepped back. Sister Ka-Lien nodded slightly and walked into the room with the White Gouda. Then Ophelia Bullard immediately followed. After the 3 of them entered, Professor Shi-Erfu closed the door and waited outside with the others. Professor Harvey's dormitory was his laboratory. If too many people entered, the laboratory would become crowded and messy. As he walked in, he asked Dake about the specific situation. Dake described in a few words how the White Gouda grew a second head in a more abstract way. Professor Harvey had a lot of experience in this. He always treated the patient, but not the cause of the illness. "I see. The 2 souls have fused together? So do you want to save the little one or the mother?" "I mean, it's not possible to save both. I have a lot of experience in cutting souls. The overlapping part can't be cut. Otherwise, whether it's the big one or the little one, both will be paralyzed. Do you understand this situation? It's like a person who has 2 heads on his neck. You can only choose to cut one of the heads from the neck, but you can't divide the body into 2 halves equally. This should be easy to understand." Because it was so easy to understand, Ophelia Bullard froze. Sister Carrion, on the other hand, was stunned for a moment before asking, "Professor Harvey, can the head you cut off breathe?" Professor Harvey smiled and said, "Hey, he won't necessarily die even if he only has 1 head left. Just put it in a jar." "Why? Are the requirements so low?" Dake interrupted helplessly. "The basic requirement is that he won't die. If possible, he should be able to talk. It's best if his brain can still work. We need him to lead the way. Also, don't be mistaken. The one outside is the one that needs to be cut off. Professor Harvey said, "Don't worry, I'm not an executioner. I'll confirm it in advance. Put him on the bed first. I need to do a thorough check and see the specific situation before making a conclusion." Fell asleep and didn't finish writing before 12 o'clock. Fortunately, it's not too late. It's not a big problem. I wrote less in the first few days of this month, but I made up for it in the middle. Hopefully, it can last for the second half of the month. The reward will be paid monthly. In the end, the number of words will be deducted from the number of days x 4,000. Now the number of words I've updated has exceeded 100,000. One more update, and I'll be able to finish the guaranteed minimum for this month, 28 days. After that, I'll be able to enter the game even more time. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Also, I actually have a very urgent problem that needs to be solved. What's a good name for Mr. Devil? Asking for votes. I'm already down. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.